There is a forest in the western edge of Canada, so vast, so old, and so deeply layered with darkness that even the people who have lived beside it for 10,000 years will not enter certain parts of it after nightfall. Not because they are afraid of animals, not because the terrain is impassable, but because of something else. Something they have known about since long before Europeans arrived, with their maps and their certainty, and their insistence that the world is explainable. The forests of British Columbia hold something that leaves footprints in the mud the size of a dinner plate, something that strips bark from trees at a height no bear could reach, something that watches from the tree line with an intelligence that is not quite animal and not quite human, and not quite anything that science has been willing to name. And tonight, we are going to go looking for it. We are going to walk through the cedars and the Sitka spruce, through the river valleys and the glacial ridges, through the oral histories of the stars, people, and the field notes of wildlife biologists who have requested, quietly, that their names not be attached to certain observations they cannot explain. We are going to look at evidence that has been collected, dismissed, reanalyzed, buried, and occasionally rediscovered by people whose careers could not survive the admission of what they actually saw. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. There is something about the deep forests of British Columbia, about the rain and the silence, and the impossibly ancient trees, that belongs to the same part of the mind that drifts when the lights go down and the day's noise fades away. So, let this carry you. Let the story unfold slowly. Maybe subscribe if you feel moved to, and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Someone is listening to this in the Okanagan Valley at 3 in the morning. Someone is listening on a ferry crossing the Strait of Georgia. Someone is in London or Manila or Montreal, and somehow the forests of British Columbia feel close enough to touch. We are going to spend a long time in these trees tonight. And by the time we are finished, you will understand why some of the most careful, rigorous, skeptical people who have ever studied the natural world of Western Canada have arrived at the same quiet, uncomfortable conclusion that something is out there, and we do not know what it is. Let us start at the beginning. Not with the famous footprint casts, or the blurry film footage, or the breathless television specials. Let us start much earlier than that. Let us start with the land itself, because the land is where the story lives, and without understanding what the forests of British Columbia actually are, the rest of this makes no sense. British Columbia is not a place that can be understood from a map. You can look at a map of it and see that it covers roughly 944,000 square kilometers, which makes it larger than every country in Western Europe combined. You can see that it is bisected by mountain ranges, the Coast Mountains and the Rockies and the Selkirks and the Monachies, ranges that in some places have never been systematically explored. You can see the rivers, the Fraser and the Thompson and the Skeena and the Stikine, rivers that run through gorges so deep and so remote that for much of human history, the only people who knew what lived in them were the indigenous peoples, whose territories those waterways defined. But you cannot feel, from a map, what it is to stand at the edge of the temperate rainforest on a November morning when the fog is lying low over the sword ferns and the fallen Sitka spruce are slowly being consumed by moss, so thick and green it looks almost luminous, and to understand, in the body rather than in the mind, how much space there is in this place, how much room for things to exist that no one has yet formally acknowledged. The temperate rainforest of British Columbia's coast is one of the last surviving examples of an ecosystem that once covered much of the northern Pacific Rim. It receives between 3 and 4 meters of rain per year in some locations. The trees, western red cedar and Sitka spruce and Douglas fir and yellow cedar, grow to sizes that seem improbable if you have only ever seen forests in drier climates. Western red cedars here live for more than 1,000 years. Some of the Douglas firs, standing in the unlogged valleys of Vancouver Island, are older than the Norman conquest of England. The forest floor in these places is not ground, exactly. It is a deep, soft accumulation of centuries of fallen wood and moss and decomposing matter that in some areas is more than a meter thick, soft enough that footsteps make almost no sound, that falling objects vanish into it without a trace. This matters because one of the persistent questions about the creature that the Stars people call Saskets and that the outside world has come to call Bigfoot or Sasquatch is, how could something that large exist without leaving consistent, findable evidence? The answer, for anyone who has spent significant time in the forests of British Columbia, is not difficult. These forests do not give up their secrets easily. They absorb things. They conceal things. Whole logging camps from the early 20th century have been swallowed so completely by the undergrowth that you can walk within 10 meters of them and see nothing. Animal carcasses decompose so quickly in the wet warmth of the coastal forest floor that a body can be unrecognizable within weeks. The terrain, with its sudden drops into river canyons and its boulder fields hidden under decades of moss growth, creates a landscape where an experienced wilderness traveler can walk for a full day and cover only a few kilometers of actual map distance. The forest is not empty. That is the other thing that matters. These ecosystems support an extraordinary density and diversity of life. Black bears and grizzly bears, wolves and wolverines, mountain lions and bobcats, Roosevelt elk and black-tailed deer, river otters and beavers and mink, eagles and ravens and great horned owls, Pacific giant salamanders and rough-skinned newts, and species of beetle that have not yet been formally catalogued by science. In 1991, a population of wolves was discovered on the islands of the central British Columbia coast that had been living in isolation for so long that they had developed distinct behavioral and physical characteristics from mainland wolves. In 2003, a new species of carnivorous mammal, the Vancouver Island marmot's close relative, was confirmed in coastal habitats that biologists had surveyed multiple times before. The forest contains surprises. It has always contained surprises. The people who know it best, the indigenous peoples whose relationship with it stretches back 12,000 years, have always said it contains more surprises than the outside world is prepared to accept. Let us talk about those people, because any honest account of what haunts the forests of British Columbia has to begin not with Roger Patterson and his 1,967 film footage, not with the casts of enormous footprints that wildlife biologist John Bindernagel spent decades cataloguing, not with the analyses conducted by physical anthropologists at American universities. It has to begin with the people who have lived in relationship with these forests for longer than agriculture has existed in Europe, and who have known about this creature consistently across a geographic range stretching from northern California to southeastern Alaska for as long as their oral traditions reach. The Stottsales people, whose territory centers on the Harrison Lake area in what is now southwestern British Columbia, have been speaking about Saskets in their oral traditions since before any of those traditions were recorded by outsiders. The name itself is not a name in the way that European explorers named things, imposing identity from the outside. It is a description that carries within it a whole complex of understanding about what this being is and what kind of relationship human communities should have with it. Saskets, in the Halki-Milam language of the Styles, refers roughly to a being that is wild, hairy, and connected to the forest in a way that places it outside the category of ordinary animal, but also outside the category of human. It is not a monster. It is not a spirit, exactly, though it exists in close relationship with the spiritual dimension of the Stottsales worldview. It is a being that occupies a kind of threshold space, neither fully part of the human world nor fully part of the animal world, which is perhaps why it is so difficult for a Western scientific framework, which requires things to be one thing or another, to accommodate it. The Halkomelem-speaking peoples of the Fraser River Delta and the Lower Mainland describe encounters with Saskets not as frightening aberrations, but as events with established protocols. There were things you were supposed to do if you encountered one. There were things you were not supposed to do. The fact that these protocols existed, that they were refined enough to be transmitted across generations as practical guidance rather than cautionary myth, tells you something important. These were not stories about a creature that people feared because they did not understand it. They were stories about a creature that people had been encountering long enough to have developed a set of appropriate responses. The Nalaka-Pamuks people of the Thompson River Valley in the interior have their own name and their own accounts. The Lilwat Nation of the area around Mount Currie have theirs. The Haida of Haida Gwaii, the archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia that was once called the Queen Charlotte Islands, speak of a hairy giant that inhabits the dense forests of those islands. The Gitsan people of the Skeena River watershed, the Tahltan people of the far north, the Ktunaxa of the southeastern corner of the province. Across the entire geographic range of what is now British Columbia, across peoples whose languages are mutually unintelligible, whose cultural practices are distinct, whose trade relationships and political alliances and histories of conflict and kinship do not always overlap. There is this consistent thread, a large, bipedal, hair-covered being that inhabits the deep forest, that is intelligent enough to be aware of human observers, that leaves enormous footprints, and that is not quite classifiable as either animal or human. That consistency matters more than any single piece of physical evidence. When you find the same description of the same kind of being across a dozen unrelated languages and cultural systems distributed over an area of nearly 1 million square kilometers, you are not looking at a shared mythology in the sense of a story that traveled. You are looking at something that multiple independent groups of people, over a very long period of time, observed and tried to describe with the conceptual tools available to them. None of this proves that the creature exists in the way that a formal scientific study with controlled variables and peer-reviewed results would prove it. But it establishes something important. The depth and breadth of the indigenous tradition is not a detail that can be dismissed as superstition or as cultural borrowing. It is the oldest and most extensive body of testimony about this phenomenon in existence, and it deserves to be treated as such. Now let us talk about the physical evidence. Because there is physical evidence, and there has been for a long time, and the question of what to do with it has been quietly tormenting a subset of the scientific community for more than half a century. The footprints came first, or at least the recorded footprints did. In August of 1958, a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew, working on a road construction project in the forests of Northern California near the British Columbia border, found enormous human-like footprints pressed into the mud around his equipment. The footprints were 16 inches long. Crew made plaster casts of them, brought them out of the forest, and showed them to a journalist named Andrew Genzoli, who worked for the Humboldt Times. Genzoli published the story, and within days, newspapers across North America had picked it up. The word Bigfoot, which had previously been used occasionally in logging camps along the Pacific coast to refer to the same kind of tracks that Crew had found, became the common term for the creature throughout the United States. But this was not the beginning of the footprints in British Columbia, not by a long measure. In 1884, a newspaper called the Daily British Colonist in Victoria published an account of the capture, near Yale, on the Fraser River, of a creature described as half man and half beast. The account described the creature, which the article called Jacko, as approximately 4.5 feet tall, covered in glossy black hair except for its hands and feet, and possessed of strength that the men who captured it found extraordinary. Whether Jacko was real, a hoax, a misidentified animal, or something else entirely has never been definitively established. The creature reportedly died in captivity before it could be examined by a scientist. The article itself has been reprinted and disputed so many times over the past century and a half that it is difficult to assess its reliability now. What is easier to assess is what happened in the decades afterward. Because after the 1958 coverage of Jerry Crew's finds, people who had been having encounters in the forests of British Columbia and who had not spoken publicly about them began to come forward. And what emerged was not a recent phenomenon triggered by the newspaper coverage. What emerged was a tradition of encounters stretching back through the entire history of European settlement in British Columbia, a tradition that in almost every respect mirrored what the indigenous peoples of those territories had been describing for millennia. Loggers were particularly important sources. The logging industry had been pushing into the remote forests of British Columbia since the 1880s, sending crews deep into valleys and watersheds that had seen no previous European presence. Those crews were sleeping in camps in old-growth forest, working before dawn and after dusk, walking through areas that by any reasonable measure qualified as genuine wilderness. And some of them, across the decades, had seen things that they described to each other but not, usually, to anyone outside the camps, because the kind of man who worked the British Columbia timber industry in the early 20th century was not a man who was eager to be thought of as unhinged. The stories that came out after 1958 were not dramatic. They were, almost universally, understated in a way that makes them feel more credible rather than less. A man working a camp near the Skagit Valley in the early 1930s described smelling something he could not identify a smell like a wet dog but much stronger, near the camp's garbage dump one evening. He went to look and saw, in the fading light, a figure standing at the edge of the trees. He described it as at least 7 feet tall, covered in dark hair, standing upright in a way that was unmistakably human, but with proportions that were not. The shoulders too wide, the arms too long, the neck almost absent, with the head appearing to sit directly on the enormous torso. He said it looked at him for perhaps 3 seconds, then turned and moved into the trees with a speed that he found difficult to reconcile with its size. He said it made no sound. He said he did not tell anyone in the camp because he knew how it would sound. That silence, that unwillingness to report because of anticipated ridicule, is one of the most consistent features of the encounter reports from British Columbia across the 20th century. It makes the phenomenon systematically underreported, which in turn makes it easy to dismiss as rare and marginal, which it is not. The wildlife biologist John Bindernagel, who spent 25 years in the Comox Valley on Vancouver Island, and who dedicated a significant portion of his professional life to the serious study of this phenomenon, estimated conservatively that for every encounter that was reported publicly, there were 10 or more that never left the immediate circle of the person who had it. Bindernagel was not a credulous man. He had a doctorate in wildlife biology from the University of Guelph and had worked for conservation organizations across Africa and the Caribbean before settling in British Columbia. He did not arrive at his interest in Sasquatch through fascination with the paranormal. He arrived at it through a series of track finds in the forests near his home that he could not explain through any other hypothesis. His 2 books, North America's Great Ape, The Sasquatch, and The Discovery of the Sasquatch, are methodical, careful, almost aggressively scientific in their approach. He does not speculate wildly. He does not invoke the supernatural. He looks at the footprints, which he examined on dozens of separate occasions in the forests of Vancouver Island and the mainland coast, and he describes what they look like and what they tell him about the biomechanics of the creature that made them, and he asks the reader to consider what kind of animal, known or unknown, could leave such a print. The prints Bindernagel studied were not simply large human footprints scaled up. That is one of the things that matters most about them, and it is one of the things that gets lost in the popular conversation about this topic. A large human footprint has a certain set of proportional relationships between heel width and toe width, between arch depth and ball width, between overall length and overall width. The footprints that Bindernagel examined, that other researchers have examined, that have been found by loggers and hunters and hikers and indigenous hunters and wildlife technicians across British Columbia over the past century, do not have those proportional relationships. They have different ones. The heel is wider relative to the overall length. The midfoot, in many of the prints, shows a distinctive double ball structure that is not present in human anatomy, but that would be consistent with a foot adapted for traversing rough terrain at significant weight. The toes show a range of configurations, some with a notably wide-set large toe, some with toes that appear more parallel than in a human foot. These are not the variations you would expect if the prints were being faked by someone wearing oversized human-shaped footboards. They are the variations you would expect from a real foot of an unusual anatomy, exhibiting the same kind of individual variation that real feet from real individuals always show. This does not mean that no prints have ever been faked. Some certainly have been. The admission by Ray Wallace's family, after his death in 2002, that Wallace had created some large footprints in the Northern California and Southern Oregon area using carved wooden feet, was widely reported as a debunking of the entire phenomenon. But this is a logical error. Demonstrating that some evidence is fraudulent does not establish that all evidence is fraudulent. The thousands of footprint finds across British Columbia, many of them reported by people with no knowledge of or interest in the Bigfoot phenomenon, many of them found in areas so remote that staging a hoax would have required extraordinary preparation, cannot all be attributed to Ray Wallace's carved wooden feet or to the handful of other confirmed hoaxes that the historical record contains. Let us move deeper into the forest now. Let us go to specific places, specific events, specific moments that exist in the record, not as folklore, but as documented encounters that the people who had them could not explain, and that in most cases they have never tried to profit from or publicize beyond the immediate circle of people they trusted. The Harrison Lake area. Roughly 100 kilometers east of Vancouver, in the southwestern corner of British Columbia, Harrison Lake is a long, narrow glacial fjord surrounded by mountains that rise steeply from the water's edge to elevations of more than 2,000 meters. The forest here is old-growth coastal temperate rainforest, dense and dark and wet, cut through by streams that run fast and cold from snowfields that never entirely melt. The Stuttsales people have called this territory home since the end of the last glaciation, when the ice retreated and the forest came down from the mountains in slow waves over centuries and millennia. They know this landscape in a way that is not the knowing of observation, but the knowing of relationship. Every river bend and ridge and valley in their territory has a name and a history, and often a story, and the stories, consistently, include Saskets. In the summer of 1995, a forestry technician named Douglas Hayes, who had been working in the Harrison Lake drainage for 7 years as part of a watershed assessment program, was conducting a routine transect survey in an area of unlogged second-growth forest when he found what he later described as a nest. He used that word deliberately and carefully. It was a circular depression in the forest floor, roughly 2.5 meters in diameter, formed from branches that had been broken and bent inward from the surrounding undergrowth. The branches were fresh, broken within the previous few days. The depression contained what Hayes identified as body impressions, areas where the vegetation was compressed and flattened in a way consistent with a large animal having lain there. Around the perimeter of the depression, Hayes found what he recognized as Sasquatch footprints. He had seen such prints described in wildlife literature and had been skeptical of them. He was less skeptical standing in front of them. He measured them at 15.5 inches in length and 7.25 inches in width. He photographed them. He returned to his base camp and reported his find to his supervisor, who told him, in language that Hayes recalled as being quite emphatic, that he was to document the footprints as belonging to an unknown animal and move on with his transect survey. Hayes told this story to a wildlife biologist who subsequently shared it with John Bindernagel. Hayes asked that his full name not be used in publication. He was still employed in the forestry sector and felt that associating his professional identity with Sasquatch evidence would be detrimental. This is not an unusual constraint for people in this situation. The number of scientists, wildlife professionals, park rangers, and government employees in British Columbia who have found or witnessed evidence they could not explain and who have requested anonymity before discussing it is, depending on who you ask, somewhere between remarkable and extraordinary. Why would a wildlife professional in British Columbia be reluctant to report a credible sighting or find? The answer requires some understanding of how professional scientific culture works, and specifically of what happens to researchers who attach their names to claims that exist outside the acknowledged boundaries of legitimate inquiry. Science is a human institution. It is subject to all of the social pressures that human institutions produce. Peer review, which is the mechanism by which scientific claims are evaluated and accepted or rejected, works well for questions that exist within the established framework of what is known. It works much less well for questions that challenge that framework fundamentally. A biologist who publishes a paper claiming evidence for an unclassified large primate in the forests of British Columbia is not going to be evaluated on the quality of their evidence alone. They are going to be evaluated on whether the claim itself is credible within the community of their peers. And the community of their peers has already decided, largely without examining the evidence in detail, that the claim is not credible. This is not dishonesty, it is not conspiracy, it is simply the way that paradigms work, and Thomas Kuhn described it very carefully in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions more than 60 years ago. Anomalies accumulate at the edges of a paradigm for a long time before they become impossible to ignore. In the meantime, the practitioners of that paradigm have strong professional incentives to dismiss the anomalies rather than to take them seriously, because taking them seriously requires acknowledging that the framework may be incomplete, which is threatening to a community that has organized its entire professional identity around the reliability of that framework. The framework that is threatened by the Sasquatch question is not a small one. It is the framework of our understanding of primate evolution and distribution in North America. The standard account holds that there are no non-human primates native to North America. The most recent primate to have inhabited the continent was Gigantopithecus blacki, a very large ape that lived in Asia, and possibly in some accounts spread into the Beringian land bridge region before going extinct sometime between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago. The idea that a large, unclassified primate could be living in the forests of British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest right now, without having been formally documented by Western science, requires either that our understanding of primate evolution and distribution is significantly incomplete, or that the creature is something other than a primate in the conventional sense, or that it has characteristics, behavioral and physical, that have allowed it to persist in wilderness areas without being captured or killed or leaving behind skeletal remains that have been found and identified. Each of these possibilities is uncomfortable in its own way. The first requires acknowledging a major gap in our inventory of North American fauna. The second opens doors to explanations that are even harder to accommodate within a materialist scientific framework. The third requires explaining an absence of evidence that is itself, in the eyes of many researchers, a significant piece of evidence. The absence of bones. This is the argument that serious skeptics return to most consistently, and it deserves serious engagement. If Sasquatch is a real animal, they argue, then where are the bones? Animals die. When they die, they leave remains. We have found the bones of animals that have been extinct for millions of years. Why have we never found the bones of a creature that, if the reports are accurate, is living right now in the forests of British Columbia? There are several answers to this, and they are not evasions. They are genuine attempts to engage with the question in good faith. The first is about the nature of bone preservation in the temperate rainforest of coastal British Columbia. Bone does not preserve well in wet, acidic environments. The soil pH in old-growth temperate rainforest is typically between 4 and 5 on the pH scale, which is acidic enough to dissolve calcium phosphate, the mineral that composes most of bone tissue, within a matter of years under normal conditions. The bones of large animals, wolves and bears and elk, do not persist in the coastal forests of British Columbia. They are consumed by the microbial community of the forest floor quickly and thoroughly. If you want to find the bones of animals that have died in the coastal forest, you need to find them in very specific circumstances, in caves, on rock outcroppings, in riverbeds, where the chemistry and the physical conditions are different from the surrounding forest. The absence of Sasquatch bones in the temperate rainforest of British Columbia is therefore not the same kind of anomaly as it would be in, say, the arid grasslands of Alberta, where bone preservation is much better and where the bones of large mammals from thousands of years ago are routinely found. The second answer involves the behavior that the encounter reports consistently attribute to this creature, and which is one of the most striking things about the overall pattern of the testimony. Across the full range of accounts from British Columbia and adjacent territories, the creature is described as actively avoiding contact with humans, not fleeing in panic the way a startled deer or bear would flee, but withdrawing deliberately, quietly, in a way that is consistent with an animal that has learned, over a very long time, that proximity to humans is dangerous. This learned avoidance, if it is real, would explain why encounters happen more often in remote areas, why they often involve the creature being observed at a distance before it detects the observer, and why the creature, when detected, typically does not linger. An animal that actively avoids humans would also be an animal that, when it is sick or dying, moves away from areas of human activity. Where do bears go to die in the forests of British Columbia? They go deep, they find remote places, and their remains, in that wet acid soil, are gone within a few years. The third answer is the one that Bindernagel, among others, found most compelling. We have not found the bones because we have not looked for them. There is no systematic program in British Columbia or in any adjacent jurisdiction to search for Sasquatch remains. The resources that would be required to conduct such a search in a meaningful way, across a landscape of nearly 1 million square kilometers, do not exist for a phenomenon that the institutional scientific community has not formally acknowledged as worthy of investigation. We find the bones of extinct animals because we go looking for them. We do not find the bones of Sasquatch because no one is going looking for them, at least not in any coordinated, well-funded, methodologically rigorous way. None of this proves that the bones exist, but it establishes that the absence of discovered bones is not itself proof that the creature does not exist. The logic does not work in that simple direction. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that principle applies here with particular force. Let us go further north. Let us go to the Skeena River watershed, which drains the interior plateau of north-central British Columbia and runs through a landscape of river valleys and forested ridges and mountains that very few people outside the region have ever seen. The Gitxsan people have their territories along the Skeena. The Wet'suwet'en people hold the watershed of the Bulkley River, a major tributary. These are nations with long, complex histories, sophisticated legal and governance systems expressed through their house and clan structures, and oral traditions that reach back into the time before recorded history with a specificity and consistency that academic researchers have, slowly, and with some resistance, begun to take seriously as historical evidence. The Gitxsan tradition includes accounts of a being called Gagyid, which is sometimes translated into English as wild man. Gagyid is not Sasquatch in the straightforward sense. The Gitxsan understanding of Gagyid is more complex, involving the idea of a person, sometimes a human person, who has become wild through some process of transformation. A hunter who stayed too long in the mountains. A person who suffered a great trauma and retreated into the forest and gradually ceased to be human in the conventional sense. But there is also a tradition of encounters with large, hair-covered beings that are clearly not transformed humans, that exist as their own kind of being in the deep forest, and that have been observed near the Skeena and its tributaries across many generations. In 1968, a man named Ernest Brown, who was working as a fish hatchery technician for the Federal Department of Fisheries at a facility on the Skeena, found a set of footprints in the mud near the river that he could not explain. Brown was not a man with any particular interest in Bigfoot. He was a government employee doing a practical job in a remote location, and what he found in the mud was a series of impressions, roughly 14 inches long, that crossed a gravel bar and disappeared into the forest on the far side. He reported the find to his supervisor in the Department of Fisheries, who sent an inquiry to the Provincial Wildlife Branch. The Provincial Wildlife Branch sent a memo back, indicating that the prints were likely from a bear walking on its hind legs. Brown, who had spent 8 years working in wilderness environments in British Columbia, did not find this explanation convincing. A bear's hind footprint does not look like a large human footprint. The anatomy is completely different. What Brown had found looked like a very large human footprint, which was the thing he found alarming about it. He made a plaster cast of one of the prints before the river came up and destroyed the rest of them. That cast, if it still exists, is not in any public collection. This story, Brown's story, is not famous. It is not part of the canon of Sasquatch encounters that gets referenced in documentaries and popular books. It exists in a file note, in a personal communication that was shared with a researcher decades after the fact. It is the kind of evidence that does not survive the filter of what gets recorded and what gets attention, but it is also the kind of evidence that is typical. The encounters that have shaped the way this phenomenon is understood in British Columbia are not mostly the dramatic ones. They are mostly the quiet ones, the people who found something they could not explain and reported it to someone who recorded it in a way that preserved it, and who then went back to their lives without trying to make anything of it. The year 1967, October. The Bluff Creek drainage in Northern California, close to the British Columbia border, in the same general geographic zone. Roger Patterson, a part-time rodeo rider with an interest in the Sasquatch phenomenon, and his associate Bob Gimlin, filmed approximately 60 seconds of footage of what appears to be a large, bipedal, hair-covered creature walking away from them along the edge of a sandbar. The Patterson-Gimlin film is the single most analyzed and debated piece of evidence in the entire history of this phenomenon. It has been examined by film experts, by primatologists, by biomechanics specialists, by costume designers, by special effects professionals, by Hollywood makeup artists, by professional skeptics, and by a long list of scientists in fields ranging from physical anthropology to forensic analysis. The consensus, to the degree that one exists, is unsatisfying. It is not possible, given the quality of the original film and the conditions under which it was shot, to definitively determine whether the subject is a human in a costume or a real animal. What can be said is that the attempts to replicate the footage using professional Hollywood costume-making techniques, including attempts made by some of the most experienced creature suit designers in the film industry, have all failed to produce a result that matches what is visible in the film, in terms of the movement of muscles and tissue under the surface of the coat, the proportions of the body, and the biomechanics of the gait. This does not prove the film is real, but it is a more significant negative finding than it is usually given credit for being. What is less often discussed in relation to the Patterson-Gimlin film is the context of the year it was made and the location in which it was made. The Bluff Creek area in Northern California, along the border with Oregon, was in the late 1960s the epicenter of reported Sasquatch activity in the documented record. Loggers and road crews had been finding enormous footprints in the area for years. Multiple independent witnesses had reported encounters in the general region. The area was remote and heavily forested, and had been subject to significant road-building activity that was pushing human presence into previously inaccessible terrain. The pattern of increased encounters following road construction into remote forest areas is one that appears consistently across the British Columbia record as well, and it is one that makes logical sense if the creature being encountered is real. Road construction disrupts habitat, concentrates food sources around construction waste, and pushes large animals out of their normal ranges and into contact with humans. If the Patterson-Gimlin film shows a real animal, it shows an animal that in October 1967 was walking along a sandbar in a drainage that had recently been significantly disturbed by human activity, in an area that had been generating encounter reports for years. That is exactly the kind of context in which you would expect to encounter an elusive large animal, if such an animal existed. It is not the context in which you would expect to encounter a man in a gorilla suit arranged for the camera. Back to British Columbia. Back to the specific. The area around the Lillooet River, which runs through the Coast Mountains north of Vancouver, has generated a particularly dense cluster of encounter reports over the past 50 years. The Lillooet River drainage includes some of the most dramatic terrain in the province. Narrow gorges cut into granite, valley floors covered in old-growth forest, side canyons that have seen almost no human activity since the last ice age. The Inshuksh Nation and the Lilwat Nation both have deep connections to this territory, and both traditions include accounts of encounters with large, hair-covered beings in these mountains. In the early 1980s, a hunting party of 4 men from the Lilwat Nation was camped in the upper Lillooet drainage, above the main valley, and in a section of subalpine forest where the trees thin out and the ground is rocky and open. 2 of the men were in their 30s, experienced hunters who had spent significant time in this territory. One was older, in his 50s or 60s, and had been hunting these mountains since he was a child. The 4th was in his early 20s, on only his 2nd or 3rd extended hunting trip. The older man woke the camp before dawn because he had heard something. What he described was a sound that was not one of the sounds he knew from this territory, a low vocalization, rhythmic, almost like breathing, but louder and with a quality that he found difficult to describe afterward, something between a bass note and a groan, sustained, coming from the edge of the tree line. They sat in the tent and listened. The sound continued for perhaps 20 minutes, then stopped. When light came, they investigated the tree line. They found, in a muddy section near a small stream, 4 footprints. The older man later described them as being the largest footprints he had ever seen in his many decades in the mountains. The prints were human in shape, but approximately twice the size of the largest human foot he could imagine. He said they were pressed deeply into the mud, indicating very substantial weight. He did not make casts because they had no plaster. He photographed them on the film camera one of the younger men had brought. Those photographs were developed and shared within the community and were seen by a number of people over the following years. Their current location is unknown. This kind of story, private, community-contained, not submitted to any investigative body or published in any record, is the substrate of the British Columbia encounter tradition. It is what lies beneath the documented cases, the famous ones, the ones that appear in databases and books. The ratio of documented to undocumented encounters is impossible to calculate precisely, but based on the accounts of researchers who have worked in Indigenous communities in British Columbia, who have spent time building the kind of trust that allows these stories to be shared, the number of encounters that never leave the community where they happen is very large. Let us talk about sound, because one of the most compelling bodies of evidence for the existence of an unidentified large primate in the forests of British Columbia and adjacent areas has nothing to do with footprints or film footage. It has to do with sound recordings, and specifically with a set of recordings made in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California in the 1970s that have been analyzed by audio specialists and primatologists in ways that have generated some of the most uncomfortable data in the entire history of this investigation. In 1972, Alan Berry and Ron Moorhead, who were hunting in the Tahoe National Forest, heard what they described as multiple large animals communicating in the forest near their camp over a period of several nights. They had recording equipment, and they made recordings. Those recordings, which came to be known as the Sierra Sounds, were subsequently analyzed by R. Lynn Curlin, a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Wyoming, who had expertise in acoustic analysis and signal processing. Curlin's analysis, published in a scientific paper, concluded that the voices on the recordings were produced by a vocal tract significantly larger than that of a human male. The resonant frequencies of the vocalizations, the formant structure that characterizes the sounds made by any vocal tract, were consistent with a primate approximately 7 to 8 feet tall and weighing several hundred pounds. The complexity of the vocalizations, their internal structure, and the relationships between different sounds in what appeared to be a sequence of communicative exchanges was also notable. Curlin was careful to say what his analysis could and could not establish. It could establish that the sounds were not produced by a human vocal tract of normal dimensions and were not electronically modified human speech. It could not establish that they were produced by an unidentified primate. But it could not identify any known animal that would produce sounds with those characteristics in that geographic region. The Sierra Sounds recording is not from British Columbia, but it is relevant because similar vocalizations have been reported across the entirety of the Sasquatch territory, including extensively in British Columbia. The pattern of reports of nighttime vocalizations from the forests of the province, vocalizations described as too large and too complex and too structured to be any known British Columbia animal, is substantial. Wildlife biologists who have worked in the remote areas of the province have, in a number of documented cases, encountered sounds that they could not attribute to any known animal of the region. Most of these encounters have not been publicly reported. They exist as personal communications, as notes in field journals, as conversations in the community of people who take this phenomenon seriously as a research question. The Okanagan Valley, the interior plateau of British Columbia. This is different country from the coastal rainforest, drier and more open, with ponderosa pine and sage in the lower elevations and mixed forests of Douglas fir and larch and birch higher up. This is not the first landscape most people think of when they think of Sasquatch. The image of the creature is almost always associated with the dense coastal forest, the ancient cedar stands, the perpetual green and grey of the Pacific rainforest. But the encounter reports from the Okanagan are substantial and span more than a century. The Silks Okanagan Nation, whose territory covers much of the southern interior of British Columbia, as well as adjacent areas of Washington state, has traditions regarding large bipedal beings in their territory that parallel the coastal traditions. The creature is known in some Silks traditions as Penticton's ancient being, a description that carries within it an implication of great antiquity, of something that has been part of the landscape long before human memory can reach. In the summer of 2007, a woman who had been working as a fruit orchard supervisor in the South Okanagan for more than 15 years was driving on a dirt road between two orchard properties at roughly 5:30 in the morning when she saw something crossing the road ahead of her. She slowed her truck and stopped. What she described later to a family member who subsequently shared the account with a researcher was a figure crossing the road in 4 or 5 strides, from the left shoulder to the right shoulder, moving quickly and upright on 2 legs. She estimated the figure's height at between 7 and 8 feet based on its relationship to a fence post whose height she knew. She described it as covered in dark reddish-brown hair, with arms that she described as too long for a person. It did not look at her. It moved from the left side of the road to a gap in the trees on the right side and disappeared. The whole event lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds. She did not report the encounter to any official body. She told her family member because she was shaken by it and needed to talk about it with someone she trusted. She worked in an agricultural community where such a story, she felt, would not be well received. She asked that her name not be used. She was certain about what she saw. She had no framework for it that made sense to her. It did not look like anything she had ever seen before, and she had spent 15 years driving those roads before dawn in a landscape where she knew every animal that was supposed to be there. This is the texture of the British Columbia encounter record. Person after person, across different landscapes, different eras, different cultural backgrounds, and professional contexts, describing something that does not fit any known category, and that they are almost universally reluctant to publicize. The reluctance is important. It is the opposite of what you would expect from people constructing hoaxes for attention. The overwhelming pattern is not attention-seeking. The overwhelming pattern is concealment, disclosure only to trusted individuals, and a request that names not be associated with the account. The question of what this creature might be, biologically, is one that has generated a range of hypotheses over the decades, and some of those hypotheses are more rigorous than others. The most widely discussed among researchers who take the phenomenon seriously is the hypothesis that Sasquatch is a surviving population of Gigantopithecus blacki, the large ape that lived in Asia from approximately 9 million years ago until somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago. Gigantopithecus was estimated, based on its jaw and teeth, which are virtually all that remains of it in the fossil record, to have stood between 8 and 10 feet tall, and to have weighed somewhere between 400 and 600 kilograms. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary animal. The hypothesis holds that a population of this species, or a closely related descendant, crossed the Beringian land bridge from Asia into North America during one of the glacial periods when the two continents were connected, and that population has persisted in the forests of the Pacific Northwest. The Gigantopithecus hypothesis has problems, several of them. The most significant is that Gigantopithecus, based on its dental morphology, appears to have been a strict vegetarian, adapted to a diet of bamboo and other tough plant material. A creature with that dietary specialization would not easily adapt to the temperate forest of British Columbia, which does not produce bamboo in meaningful quantities. The hypothesis also requires a much larger population than the encounter record suggests, since any viable breeding population of large primates would need to number in the thousands at minimum to avoid extinction over long periods. But the Gigantopithecus hypothesis is not the only one. Some researchers have proposed that the creature is more closely related to Paranthropus, a genus of robust Australopithecus that lived in Africa and that had the large body and robust build that would be consistent with the Sasquatch description. This hypothesis requires an even more dramatic dispersal event than the Gigantopithecus hypothesis, and the fossil record does not currently support such a dispersal. A third hypothesis, one that appears in the literature less often but that has attracted some serious attention, is the idea that what is being encountered in the forests of British Columbia is not a non-human primate at all, but a relict population of Homo erectus, or a related archaic human. The argument is that Homo erectus, which was remarkably successful and adaptable, dispersed widely across Asia and may have crossed into North America earlier than any currently confirmed human migration event. A population that had been in North America for 300,000 years or more would have had abundant time to adapt to the forest environments of the Pacific Northwest and to develop behavioral strategies for avoiding contact with the anatomically modern humans who arrived later. The archaic human hypothesis has an appealing feature that the other hypotheses lack. It could explain the behavior that witnesses consistently describe: the active, intelligent avoidance of human contact, the apparent ability to observe humans without being detected, the complex vocalizations, the social behavior that some witnesses have reported, the impression of groups rather than solitary individuals. An archaic human population, with language and social structure and accumulated knowledge of the landscape, would be much better equipped to avoid detection than a non-human primate would be. This hypothesis also connects in an interesting way to certain indigenous traditions. The beings described in the oral histories of many British Columbia First Nations are not simply large animals. They are beings with agency, with intelligence, with something that functions like intention. They are beings that can choose to be seen or not seen. They are beings with relationships to the human communities that share their territory, relationships that are not the relationships of predator and prey or of one animal with another, but something more complex. something that implies a kind of kinship at a distance. None of these hypotheses can currently be confirmed. The definitive evidence, a biological sample of sufficient quality to allow genetic analysis, has not been obtained. Or if it has been obtained, the results have not been published. There are persistent stories in the research community about DNA samples that were submitted to laboratories and that returned anomalous results that were not consistent with any known species, and that the laboratories involved declined to publish. These stories cannot be verified through any public record. They exist in the same space as much of the other evidence in this case, reported by people with professional reputations to protect, involving institutions that have strong incentives not to be associated with this topic, unverifiable in the absence of the original data. Let us return to the forests. Let us leave the theoretical frameworks behind for a moment and go back to the specific, the physical, the texture of what people actually encounter when they encounter something in the deep woods of British Columbia that they cannot explain. The Squamish River Valley. The river runs through a dramatic landscape north of the town of Squamish, where the Stawamus Chief, an enormous granite massif, rises nearly 700 meters from the valley floor. The forest here transitions from coastal temperate rainforest in the lower valley to mixed subalpine forest as the elevation increases. It is heavily used country in the lower sections, with logging activity and recreation, but the upper valley becomes very quickly remote and extremely rugged. A trail crew working in the upper Squamish Valley in the late 1990s, maintaining a backcountry trail that sees perhaps a few hundred users per year, found a section of trail where something had moved through the forest parallel to the trail, snapping off branches at a height of approximately 7 to 8 feet from the ground. The broken branches were fresh. The breaks were clean, not torn the way a bear breaking through undergrowth would leave a break, but snapped, as if something with sufficient upper body strength had simply pushed through the undergrowth at a height that no known large mammal in the area could easily reach. The breaks extended for approximately 200 meters before stopping. The trail crew foreman, a man who had been doing backcountry work in British Columbia for more than 20 years, did not know what to make of it. He did not file a formal report. He told the story to other trail crew members, and it circulated informally within the community of backcountry workers in the area for several years. He noted that the line of broken branches was completely straight, as if whatever made them was traveling on a deliberate course rather than wandering. He noted that there was no other sign of disturbance, no digging, no scat, no claw marks on the trees, nothing that would be associated with any large known animal of the area. He noted that the height of the breaks was the most troubling thing. The height is significant across many reports. A bear standing on its hind legs could reach perhaps 5.5 to 6 feet. An elk, rearing, could reach higher, but an elk moving through undergrowth does not typically snap branches off cleanly at a consistent height. The consistent pattern of breaks at 7 to 8 feet above the ground, observed in multiple locations across British Columbia over the years, is one of the items in the encounter record that researchers find most difficult to attribute to known causes. There is something else that appears in the British Columbia record, with a frequency that is difficult to account for through coincidence or misidentification: the wood knocking. The striking of wood against wood, tree against tree, or a hard object against a tree trunk, producing a loud, resonant, carrying sound that echoes through the forest. Multiple witnesses across the province have reported hearing this sound in areas where they subsequently found other signs of an unidentified large animal. The behavior appears in multiple indigenous traditions as a known characteristic of the creature. It is described as a form of communication, something the creature does to signal to others of its kind, or to warn, or to establish presence. Wildlife researchers who have worked in remote areas of British Columbia have occasionally reported hearing wood knocking that they could not attribute to any known wildlife behavior. The species in British Columbia that make sounds of this general type, woodpeckers, certain grouse doing their wing drumming on logs, do not produce sounds that carry anything like the distance or volume that witnesses describe. The sound that is reported is consistently described as loud, as resonant, as clearly intentional, and as carrying for considerable distances through the forest. It is often reported in multiples, as exchanges, a knock answered by another knock from a different direction, then another from a third direction, establishing what witnesses describe as a triangulating pattern around their position. This triangulating behavior, if it is real, is itself remarkable. It implies coordination between multiple individuals, implies a purpose behind the behavior, implies a level of social intelligence that places whatever is producing it in a different category from ordinary wildlife. The bears and wolves and cougars of British Columbia do not coordinate their movements around human observers in the way that these encounters describe. The birds of the forest do not produce organized knock sequences that locate a human from multiple angles. Whatever is doing this, if these accounts are accurate, is doing something that only a highly intelligent social animal would do. The town of Bella Coola sits at the end of a long, steep valley where the coast mountains reach the Pacific in the territory of the Nuxalk Nation. It is accessible by a road that was not completed until 1953, and that remains one of the most dramatic and dangerous paved roads in Canada. The valley itself is deep and narrow, with the mountains rising almost vertically from the flat valley floor to peaks of 2,000 meters and more. The river, the Bella Coola River, runs cold and clear through this valley, fed by glaciers that hang on the peaks above. The Nuxalk Nation has deep and specific traditions regarding large, hairy beings in their territory. Historian and Nuxalk knowledge keeper Archie Pootlas documented some of these traditions in the 1990s as part of an effort to record and preserve Nuxalk oral history. What Pootlas documented was not a vague sense of a wild creature in the forest, but specific accounts of encounters with beings that are described with considerable physical specificity. Large, walking upright, covered in hair, with a distinctive smell, with a habit of appearing near the river at dawn and dusk, with vocalizations that the Nuxalk could describe in detail because they had been hearing them for a very long time. The Nuxalk tradition, like the Steezales tradition and the Gitxsan tradition, does not treat these beings as simply large animals. The relationship is more complex, more reciprocal, more laden with protocol and responsibility. There are things you do when you encounter one. There are things you do not do. You do not follow it. You do not make a loud noise. You do not show aggression. You do not try to corner it or capture it. You acknowledge its presence, and you allow it to leave if it chooses to leave. And you remember the encounter because it is significant, because it is an encounter across a boundary that humans and these beings have maintained for a very long time. The protocols of non-confrontation that run through the indigenous traditions of British Columbia are, when you think about them from an outside perspective, exactly the protocols that a community would develop over a long period of coexistence with a large, powerful, intelligent, and generally non-aggressive animal that shared their territory. They are not the protocols of communities dealing with a mythological creature. They are the protocols of communities that have learned, through experience, how to live alongside something real. The Haida Gwaii Archipelago, 130 kilometers off the northern coast of British Columbia, isolated from the mainland by the deep waters of Hecate Strait. These islands are among the most biologically distinct places in Canada. Their isolation over long geological periods has produced species found nowhere else, including the subspecies of black bear known as the Haida Gwaii black bear, which is genetically distinct from mainland black bears and significantly larger. The forests of Haida Gwaii are old-growth Sitka spruce and western red cedar, dramatic and dense and dark, covering every hill and valley of the main island of Graham and the southern island of Moresby. The Haida people have been on these islands for at least 12,000 years. Some accounts suggest significantly longer, and their relationship with the forest and its inhabitants is the relationship of people who have nowhere else to go. The islands are their world. Every species, every feature, every behavior of the forest is known to them with the intimacy of long habitation. The Haida traditions do include accounts of large bipedal hair-covered beings in the forests of the islands. The details of these accounts are not widely published outside the Haida community, partly because the Haida, like many First Nations, are appropriately careful about which aspects of their oral traditions are shared publicly and which remain within the community. But researchers who have worked respectfully with the Haida community have confirmed that the tradition exists and that it is described with the same general characteristics as the traditions from the mainland: large, upright, hair-covered, intelligent, ancient. The biological question is interesting in the Haida Gwaii context because the islands are separated from the mainland by deep water that even during glacial maxima would not have been bridged by dry land across its full width. If the creature is a large primate or archaic human, how did it reach the islands? The answer that the Haida themselves offer is that the beings have always been there, that they were on the islands before the Haida arrived, or that they arrived on the islands in ways that do not require a land bridge. The possibility of a population that crossed the Hecate Strait by swimming, or using primitive watercraft, or traveling across ice during glacial periods, is not as implausible as it might sound for an animal of the intelligence and capability that the descriptions suggest. The Haida-Gwaii sub-question is a reminder that this phenomenon, wherever it exists, has existed for a very long time. Long enough that it predates not just European settlement, but the arrival of any humans on some of the most remote landscapes it inhabits. Long enough that the creatures that have been described in indigenous traditions across British Columbia are not a recent development. They are an ancient presence. They are woven into the landscape in the way that the rivers and the mountains and the tides are woven into the landscape. They have been there so long that the human communities that share their territory have had sufficient time to develop not just descriptions but protocols, not just stories but knowledge. The summer of 2019, a provincial parks maintenance crew was working in the backcountry of Tweedsmuir Provincial Park, one of the largest provincial parks in British Columbia, covering nearly 1 million hectares of subarctic wilderness in the north-central interior. They were assessing trail conditions in an area that sees minimal visitation, a section of park accessible only by floatplane or by multi-day backpacking from the nearest road. 2 members of the crew, both experienced backcountry workers with many seasons in remote environments, were walking a section of trail near a small lake when they smelled something. Both of them noted it simultaneously. They later described it as a smell unlike anything they had encountered in years of backcountry work in British Columbia. Not the smell of a dead animal, which they both knew well. Not the smell of a bear, which they also knew well. Something they struggled to find adequate comparison for. One of them said, afterward, that the closest thing he could think of was a very large primate enclosure in a zoo, but much stronger. The other said it was like a combination of musk and rotting vegetation and something else she could not place, something that made the hair on her arms stand up. They stopped walking. They stood still and listened. For perhaps 30 seconds, they heard nothing unusual. Then, from the tree line approximately 40 meters to their right, they heard a sound. A single, sustained vocalization, low in pitch. Not a growl, not a howl. Something they both described, independently, as somewhere between a moan and a word without meaning. A sound with a human quality, but coming from something that was not human. It lasted for perhaps 4 or 5 seconds, and then stopped. They looked at each other. They walked back to their camp, which was approximately 2 kilometers behind them on the trail. They did not discuss what they had heard until they were in the tent that night. They did not file a formal report. They talked about it between themselves over the next few days, and decided that they did not know what it was. One of them subsequently mentioned it to a friend who works in the Conservation Officer Service, and that conversation eventually found its way, through a chain of personal connections, to a researcher who has been collecting encounter accounts from backcountry workers in British Columbia for more than a decade. The researcher has, at last count, more than 200 similar accounts from backcountry professionals in British Columbia alone. Workers in parks, forestry technicians, wildlife biologists, conservation officers, survey crews, oil and gas workers in the northern part of the province, pipeline inspection crews. None of these accounts, in isolation, would be considered convincing evidence for anything. But the pattern, the same cluster of characteristics described by people who do not know each other, who have no connection to the Sasquatch research community, who have strong professional disincentives to report such encounters, who have subsequently been reluctant to attach their names to the accounts, is itself a form of data. It is the kind of data that, in any other context, would be taken seriously. We have not talked yet about the thermal imaging and camera trap evidence, because it is complicated and because it requires a careful approach, but it is relevant. Wildlife researchers in British Columbia and adjacent jurisdictions use camera traps extensively. Camera traps are automatic cameras triggered by motion sensors, placed in wildlife corridors, near water sources, along trails, and in other locations where animal activity is expected. They have revolutionized wildlife biology. They have documented species in places where they were previously unknown. They have filmed behaviors that were never observed by human eyes. They are, in general, an extremely effective tool for documenting the presence and behavior of large animals in remote areas. No camera trap, to date, has produced a photograph of a Sasquatch that has been accepted as genuine by mainstream science. This is frequently cited as significant negative evidence. If the creature is moving through the forests of British Columbia with any regularity, the argument goes, it should have been captured on camera by now. There are several responses to this. The first is scale. The camera trap network in British Columbia, though substantial, covers a tiny fraction of the total wilderness area of the province. The cameras that are deployed are concentrated in areas where wildlife research is being conducted, which tend to be areas with established wildlife populations and relatively accessible terrain. The most remote areas of the province, where the encounter reports are concentrated, are largely outside the camera trap network. The second response is behavioral. Camera traps work because most animals do not know they are there. A very intelligent animal with a keen sense of smell, the ability to detect the electronic components and chemical signatures of camera traps, could potentially avoid them. The Sasquatch encounter record includes, in a number of instances, reports of camera traps that appeared to have been moved or tampered with, reports that have been dismissed by mainstream researchers as equipment malfunction, but that the people placing the cameras found puzzling, given the specific manner of the displacement. The third response is that there is, in fact, camera trap footage that has been produced, and that is ambiguous rather than clearly non-evidential. Several video clips from wildlife cameras in the forests of British Columbia and adjacent areas have shown large bipedal figures that cannot be definitively identified as either human or bear or any other known animal. These clips exist. They have been analysed. The analyses have produced no clear conclusion. They have not been taken seriously by mainstream science because mainstream science has not taken the underlying question seriously. There is one piece of camera trap evidence that deserves specific mention. In 2015, a wildlife camera placed by a provincial wildlife biologist in a monitoring program in the central interior of British Columbia captured an image of a large figure at the edge of a forest clearing. The figure appeared bipedal and tall, with proportions that the biologist who placed the camera could not attribute to any known large animal in the area. The camera had been placed to monitor moose activity in a known moose corridor. The biologist, whose name has not been made public, submitted the image to a supervisor and received an instruction to reclassify the image as an artifact of the motion trigger system and to proceed with the monitoring program. The biologist mentioned the incident in a subsequent conversation with a colleague who was unconnected to the original program. That colleague later described the conversation to a researcher in this field. The image does not appear to have been preserved in any accessible archive. The northwestern corner of British Columbia, the Stikine country, this is territory so remote and so vast that even the people who live nearest to it, the Tahltan Nation whose ancestral territory it comprises, to know only portions of it with the intimacy that would be needed for comprehensive knowledge. The Stikine River drains a watershed of approximately 50,000 square kilometers. The landscape is one of deep river canyons, volcanic plateaus, subarctic forest, and mountains that have been given no formal names. It is the kind of landscape in which the absence of documented evidence for anything is entirely unremarkable, because the landscape has not been systematically surveyed. The Tahltan people have traditions regarding large, bipedal beings in their territory. The accounts from the Stikine country share the general characteristics of the British Columbia tradition, but are, in some respects, more specific about location. Certain areas of the Stikine watershed, specific river confluences, specific volcanic landscapes, specific sections of subalpine terrain, are mentioned consistently in the Tahltan accounts as places where encounters have been particularly common. This geographical specificity is consistent with what you would expect from a real animal with a real home range, as opposed to a generalized mythological creature that exists everywhere equally. In 2004, a group of 4 Tahltan hunters was traveling by boat up a section of the Stikine when they saw, on the bank ahead of them, something they could not identify. They cut the motor and drifted. What they described later was a figure standing at the water's edge, bent over the river in a posture consistent with drinking or fishing. The figure was large. It was covered in dark brown hair. It was standing upright. not in the hunched posture of a bear using its forelegs to support itself at the water's edge. When it heard the boat, despite the silence of the cut engine, it straightened to its full height and turned to look at them. They estimated its height at between 7 and 8 feet. It looked at them for a moment. Then it turned and moved into the tree line at a pace one of the hunters later described as unhurried but very fast, covering ground in strides that were far longer than a human stride. It made no sound. None of the 4 men spoke for perhaps a minute. Then the oldest of them, a man who had been hunting the stikine for 4 decades, said that he had heard about such things all his life and had always half believed, and now he believed completely. He said he felt no fear, which surprised him. He said it looked at them the way an intelligent animal looks at you when it knows you are not a threat. Not like prey looks at a predator, more like the way a person looks at someone they have seen before and recognize but do not need to engage with. This quality of non-fear, or of a fear quickly replaced by something more complicated, appears in many of the British Columbia encounter accounts. People describe feeling afraid initially, in the moment of the encounter, and then feeling something shift. A quality in the encounter that is different from the fear response to a dangerous predator. A sense, some describe it, of being observed by something that is making an assessment. Something that is intelligent enough to determine whether the human in front of it is a threat, and that communicates that determination through its own behavior. The accounts where the creature appears aggressive are very much in the minority. The great majority of accounts describe a creature that is cautious, that does not linger, that maintains a distance, that retreats when approached. This non-aggression is itself a piece of data. A large predator that had no learned context for human danger would not necessarily behave this way. A large animal encountering humans for the first time would be more likely to show either aggression or extreme flight. The behavioral pattern that the encounter reports describe consistently, over a geographic range of hundreds of kilometers and a time span of more than a century in the documented record alone, is the pattern of an animal that knows what humans are, that has a long history of contact with them, and that has developed a stable behavioral strategy for managing those encounters. It avoids, it observes, it retreats, it does not attack, unless, in a small subset of accounts, it feels cornered or directly threatened. This behavioral stability is one of the things that makes the phenomenon hard to dismiss as a collection of misidentifications. Misidentified bears or elk or other large animals would produce a much more variable behavioral pattern. Hoaxes, aimed at frightening people, would presumably produce more dramatic and more aggressive encounters. What the record actually contains is a creature that behaves with what appears to be consistent intelligence and consistent caution across vast distances and many decades, in ways that are entirely coherent if the creature is real, and not coherent if it is the product of misidentification or fabrication. Let us talk about what is happening at the frontier of research on this question, because there are people doing serious, methodologically rigorous work on it, and their work deserves to be discussed with the seriousness it is due. Todd Disotell, a primatologist at New York University, has analyzed dozens of alleged Sasquatch DNA samples. His results have been, consistently, that the samples belong to known species: bears, deer, human beings, dogs, coyotes. He has found no unknown primate DNA in any sample submitted to him. Disotell is honest about what this means and what it does not mean. It means that the samples submitted to him were not from an unidentified primate. It does not mean that such samples do not exist, or that the people who submitted them found what they thought they found, or that the phenomenon itself can be explained by misidentification of known animals. He remains professionally skeptical of the phenomenon, but personally fascinated by the question of why so many people have such consistent experiences. Melba Ketchum, a forensic DNA analyst, conducted a study that was published in 2013 in a journal that she and her colleagues created for the purpose, after the study was rejected by established journals. The study claimed to have analyzed DNA from purported Sasquatch samples and found a novel primate with mitochondrial DNA, most closely related to modern humans, but with nuclear DNA that differed significantly from any known primate. The study was widely criticized by other geneticists for methodological problems, including contamination controls, sample provenance, and the interpretation of unusual sequences as evidence of a novel species rather than as evidence of contamination or sequencing errors. The study has not been replicated by independent researchers. Its conclusions cannot currently be evaluated as valid by mainstream genetic science. The Ketchum study is worth mentioning, not because it provides definitive evidence, because it does not, but because it illustrates the difficulty that this field of research faces. Even when someone makes a serious effort to apply molecular biological methods to this question, the lack of an established framework for evaluating the results, combined with the professional pressure not to take the question seriously, produces a situation where the work cannot be assessed fairly. Contaminated samples are a real problem in ancient and environmental DNA analysis, and the Ketchum study's critics may well be correct that contamination explains some or all of the anomalous sequences. But the circumstance in which a study like this can only be published in a journal the authors created themselves speaks to the failure of established institutions to provide a legitimate pathway for this research. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, has done the most rigorous published work on the locomotion and morphology of footprints attributed to an unknown bipedal primate. His book, Sasquatch: Legend Meets Science, published by a mainstream academic press, presents his analysis of more than 300 alleged Sasquatch footprints and argues, with the professional authority of someone who studies the biomechanics of human and primate locomotion, that a significant subset of those prints could not have been produced by known animals or by conventional hoax methods. Meldrum's work has been criticized by colleagues, and he has faced professional pressure for taking this question seriously. He has continued to pursue it because, as he has said in multiple interviews, the physical evidence does not allow him to dismiss it. Meldrum's analysis of the prints focuses on features that are difficult to fake and that are consistent across prints found in different locations and at different times by different people. The mid-tarsal break, a flexibility in the middle of the foot that produces a characteristic shape in the footprint, not present in the human foot, but consistent with a large primate, adapted to arboreal or rough terrain locomotion. The dermal ridge patterns, fingerprint-like ridges on the bottom of the foot that appear in some of the better preserved prints, and that show a complexity inconsistent with fabrication. The depth and pressure distribution patterns in the prints, which are consistent with a very large animal, and which would require the kind of force that cannot easily be replicated with a footboard or similar hoaxing device. Meldrum is not arguing that every alleged Sasquatch footprint is genuine. He is arguing that a significant subset of them, the ones with the most detail and the most complex anatomy, cannot be explained as hoaxes with any known hoaxing technique. This is a more modest claim than the popular presentation of this topic usually suggests, but it is also a more defensible one. It is late now. The forest is dark, not the managed darkness of a city park at night, with its distant sodium vapor lights, and its distant traffic sound, and its distant awareness of buildings and streets. The forest of British Columbia at night is a different quality of dark entirely. The dark of old growth at 2 in the morning is total, in the way that the dark of a deep cave is total, except that it is alive. There are sounds in it, small sounds, close to the ground. The wing beats of a great horned owl passing 20 meters overhead. The distant, slow creak of an enormous cedar responding to a wind that you cannot feel from where you are standing. And then sometimes, nothing. A silence so complete that you become aware of your own heartbeat. It is in this kind of silence that people have heard the sounds they cannot explain. The knock from the tree line that is answered by a knock from a different tree line. The vocalization that carries too far and resonates at a frequency too low for any animal you can name in this forest. The sense, which is not a rational thing, and which the rational mind is immediately suspicious of, that something is watching from the dark beyond the firelight, something patient, something intelligent, something that has been in these trees for a very long time, and that has a quality of presence that is different from the presence of a bear or a wolf, different from the presence of anything that has a formal entry in the animal identification guides of British Columbia. People who have felt this describe it in ways that are remarkably consistent. A prickling awareness, a sense of being assessed, not threatened necessarily, but studied, observed by something that is making a judgment about the observer. The indigenous descriptions of encounters often include this quality, this sense of something deliberate and attentive on the other side of the encounter. It is not the quality of a random wildlife encounter, It is the quality of a meeting between two kinds of beings, both of whom are aware of the significance of the moment. What does the future hold for this question? Is there a path toward resolution, toward the definitive evidence that would allow mainstream science to acknowledge formally that something unknown inhabits the forests of British Columbia? There are a few candidates. The most obvious is environmental DNA, which is the collection and sequencing of genetic material from environmental samples such as soil, water, and air. The technology for environmental DNA analysis has advanced dramatically in recent years. It is now possible to detect the presence of specific species in an ecosystem from water samples collected from streams and rivers, without ever seeing the animal directly. Programs using eDNA are already tracking the presence of rare and endangered species in British Columbia waterways. A systematic eDNA survey of streams and rivers in areas with high concentrations of encounter reports would be a meaningful piece of research. If the creature is real and has been drinking from and moving through these waterways, there should be recoverable DNA in the water. The absence of such DNA in a comprehensive survey would be significant negative evidence. The presence of sequences that do not match any known species would be significant positive evidence. This survey has not been done, at least not by any institution that has published the results. The second candidate is acoustic monitoring. Passive acoustic monitoring technology, which can record and analyze sounds across large areas continuously over extended periods, has also advanced significantly. Deploying arrays of acoustic sensors in areas with high encounter rates and systematically analyzing the resulting data for sounds that do not match known species of the region would be a straightforward, scientifically rigorous approach to this question. Again, this has not been done at any meaningful scale. The third candidate is the expansion of camera trap coverage into the most remote areas of the province, areas that are currently largely unmonitored. This would require resources and logistical commitment that have not been forthcoming from any institution, because no institution has yet been willing to formally acknowledge the question as legitimate enough to fund. The barrier to each of these approaches is not technical. The barrier is institutional. The scientific community's unwillingness to formally engage with this question, to provide the funding and the institutional support that would allow it to be investigated with the rigor it deserves, is itself a phenomenon worth examining. Why has no major university in British Columbia, a province with 3 major research universities and a substantial tradition of biological and anthropological research, ever committed resources to a systematic investigation of a phenomenon that has been described by thousands of people across the province's history? The answer, at least partly, is the weight of ridicule. The Bigfoot question has been so thoroughly colonized by sensationalism and hoaxing and bad television that any serious researcher who approaches it is immediately contaminated by association. The Sasquatch question is not taken seriously because it is not taken seriously, which is a circular situation that the scientific community has allowed to persist for decades without examining whether the circularity itself is justified. There is a historical parallel that is relevant here. For much of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, accounts of a large ape in Central Africa were treated with similar skepticism by the Western scientific establishment. The gorilla was known to indigenous communities across Central Africa long before Western science acknowledged its existence. Western naturalists had been receiving reports of an enormous primate since at least the 1840s. The first specimens, shot by European hunters and brought back to Europe for examination, reached scientists in the 1860s. Even then, the acceptance of the gorilla as a real animal was slower and more contested than it should have been, given the quantity of evidence available. The parallel is not perfect. The gorilla was found in environments that were being systematically colonized by European powers, which made the eventual collection of specimens essentially inevitable. The forests of British Columbia are not being systematically surveyed in the same way, but the basic dynamic of a large animal known to indigenous peoples that Western science was slow to acknowledge is one that the history of biology provides more than once. The okapi, the giant panda, the coelacanth, the mountain gorilla. In each case, stories that had been told by local people for generations were eventually confirmed to describe something real, and in each case, the Western scientific establishment's initial response had been skepticism or dismissal. None of this proves that Sasquatch is real, but it is a reminder that the dismissal of indigenous knowledge and the dismissal of encounter reports by people without professional standing is not a reliable guide to what actually exists in the world. The mountains above the Chilcotin Plateau, in the interior of British Columbia, have their own character, distinct from the coastal forest and distinct from the Rocky Mountain ranges to the east. The Chilcotin is a high plateau, sitting at elevations of between 1,200 and 2,000 meters, covered in lodgepole pine forest and crossed by rivers that run through canyons of surprising depth. The Chilcotin Nation, who have inhabited this country since time before memory, have a detailed and sophisticated relationship with the landscape that extends to the creatures that share it with them. The Chilcotin traditions include accounts of large, hair-covered beings in the plateau and mountain forests of their territory. These accounts are specific in ways that generalized mythology rarely is. They describe where the encounters happen, near rivers, near berry patches in late summer, near the higher elevation meadows where prey animals congregate. They describe the seasons of encounters, more common in late summer and fall than in winter, which would be consistent with an animal that moves to lower elevations as winter approaches, following the food. They describe the behavior at the point of encounter in ways that match the descriptions from other parts of the province. In 2011, a Chilcotin elder, who had been documenting oral traditions in her community for many years, shared an account with an anthropologist from a British Columbia university. The account described an encounter that she herself had had, not inherited knowledge but personal experience, in the mountains above the Chilcotin River when she was in her late 30s. She was gathering berries with two other women when all three of them became aware simultaneously of a smell they recognized. She described the smell, and her description matched the descriptions given by non-Indigenous encounter witnesses across the province. Very strong, complex, animal but with something else in it. They stopped moving and waited. After a few minutes, from the downslope edge of the berry patch, something moved in the willows. It moved slowly, deliberately. It did not rush. They caught glimpses of dark hair, of something large. Then it stopped moving. It seemed to be watching them from behind the willows. They stood still. The elder said she felt no fear, which she attributed to a lifetime of hearing about these encounters and to knowledge of the appropriate protocols. She spoke quietly to her companions, telling them not to move. They stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then the thing in the willows moved again, slowly, and was gone. They gathered their berries and went home. She had not told this story publicly before the 2011 conversation because, she said, it did not need to be told publicly. It was something she knew. It was not something that needed to be argued about with people who did not know the land. That quality, the sense that the knowledge is self-evident to people with sufficient relationship to the landscape and requires no validation from outside, is something that runs through many of the Indigenous accounts from British Columbia. The question of whether Sasquatch exists is not, for many Indigenous people in this province, a question at all. It exists. It has always existed. The debate that takes place in the outside world, the endless back and forth between believers and skeptics, between researchers with plaster casts and scientists with reasons to dismiss them, is a debate about something that the people who have lived in this landscape for thousands of years do not find doubtful. This does not mean that the Indigenous knowledge is beyond question. Knowledge of all kinds can be wrong. Oral traditions can incorporate elements that are not accurate records of physical events. The gap between a being that exists in a literal physical sense and a being that exists in a deeply significant cultural sense can be difficult to assess from outside the culture. These are legitimate methodological complications, but the consistency of the tradition across nations that are linguistically and culturally distinct is not a complication that can be easily set aside. If the being described in the traditions is purely cultural in origin, a constructed being rather than a described one, then the same construction appears independently in a dozen or more distinct cultural contexts across a geographic range of nearly 1 million square kilometers. That level of independent parallel construction requires an explanation that is at least as complex as the alternative explanation, which is that the tradition describes something real. We are coming close now to the end of our time in these forests. We have covered a great deal of ground. The oral traditions of the Styles and the Gitsan and the Taltan and the Nuxalk and the Chilcotin and the Silks and the Haida The footprints that John Bindernagel spent 2 decades documenting, that Jeff Meldrum has analysed with the tools of a professional anatomist, the encounter accounts from loggers and hunters and wildlife technicians and parks workers and backcountry crew members who had no interest in publicity and strong reasons to stay quiet. The vocalizations that have been recorded and that have been analysed and that don't match any known animal of the region. The nested behavioural pattern of deliberate avoidance and intelligent retreat that runs through the encounter reports across a century and a half of documented history. What can we say at the end of all this? We can say that something is generating these accounts, something consistent enough in its physical characteristics, something consistent enough in its behaviour, something consistent enough in the quality of experience it produces in the people who encounter it, to produce a testimony record that is remarkable for its coherence across enormous distances and many decades. We can say that the explanations offered by skeptics, misidentification of known animals, hoaxing, cultural transmission of mythology, do not adequately account for the totality of the record. They account for some of it. But the portion they account for, the obviously misidentified bears, the clearly constructed footprints, the stories that clearly derive from other stories rather than from direct experience, when subtracted from the full record, still leaves a substantial remainder that these explanations do not address. We can say that the indigenous traditions of British Columbia, examined not as primitive superstition, but as knowledge systems, with 10,000 years of accumulated observation behind them, describe something that has been in these forests for a very long time, something that has a relationship with the human communities of this landscape, something that is neither simply an animal, nor simply a spirit, but something that occupies, in the understanding of the people who know it best, a threshold space between those categories that our Western scientific framework is not well equipped to evaluate. We can say that the scientific community's failure to take this question seriously is itself a phenomenon that deserves examination, and that the history of biology provides examples of similar failures that were eventually corrected by the arrival of physical evidence that could not be denied. And we can say, sitting quietly in the dark, that the forests of British Columbia are large enough and old enough and deep enough to hold things that we do not yet know, that the inventory of species in those forests is not complete, that the history of biological science is a history of things that did not exist until they were found to exist, and that the absence of finding is not the same as the absence of being. The creature that the stars call Saskets, and that the Gitsan call by their own name, and that the Nuxalk know in their mountain forests, and that the Haida know on their rain-dark islands, may or may not be waiting in the cedars right now. Something is out there in the darkness of those unlogged valleys, in those river canyons that see no human visitor from one decade to the next, in the glacially carved landscapes of the northwest coast where the mountains reach the sea with barely a strip of beach between them. Something has been leaving those footprints. Something has been making those sounds. Something has been watching from the tree line of 100 different camps and field stations and logging roads and backcountry trails, and in almost every case, it has chosen not to engage. It has chosen to retreat into the darkness and the silence of the forest that it knows far better than we do. Maybe it knows something we do not. Maybe it has learned, in the tens of thousands of years it has been in these forests, that the wisest relationship with the curious and often dangerous species that arrived here most recently is a quiet one, a watchful one, a relationship maintained at the edge of visibility, where presence can be felt without being confirmed, where the boundary between the known and the unknown is held deliberately by an intelligence older and perhaps more patient than our own. The forests of British Columbia are still out there in the dark. The cedar is still growing. The rivers are still running cold and clear from the mountains. The old growth stands on the slopes above the inlets have been growing since before the first Europeans sailed into these waters, and they will be growing long after all of this debate has faded into whatever the future holds. Something moves through those trees in the night that we cannot explain, and that is, perhaps, exactly as it should be. The world is larger than our understanding of it. The forest has always known this, and the forest can wait. As the last of the fire dies down, as the sounds of the night forest settle around you, there is one more thing to consider, one more thread to follow before sleep claims you entirely. The question of why this matters, not in the sensational sense, not in the sense of what it would mean for our classification of species, or for our understanding of primate evolution, or for the careers of the researchers who have spent their professional lives on this question, but in a deeper sense, in the sense of what it means for the way we understand ourselves and our relationship to the world we inhabit. If the creature is real, if there is something in those forests that has coexisted with human beings on this continent for 10,000 years or more, something intelligent enough and aware enough to maintain that coexistence through a policy of deliberate concealment, then what does that tell us about the nature of consciousness, about the nature of intelligence, about the nature of what it means to be present in a landscape in a full and knowing way? The indigenous traditions of British Columbia suggest that the answer involves reciprocity, that the relationship between the human communities of these forests and the beings that share them has always been understood as a relationship with responsibilities on both sides, that the appropriate response to an encounter with something wild and unknown and intelligent is not to pursue it and corner it and capture it, but to acknowledge it and allow it the space it needs, and remember that the landscape you inhabit is a shared one. That is a very different starting point from the one that Western science begins with when it approaches this question. Western science begins with the assumption that the appropriate response to an unknown thing is to obtain a specimen, to classify it, to fit it into the existing framework of knowledge. The indigenous starting point is that the appropriate response to an unknown thing is to build a relationship with it, to understand what kind of being it is, and what it needs, and what the protocols of respectful coexistence require. If the forests of British Columbia hold something we have not yet formally acknowledged, perhaps the path toward understanding it begins not with a specimen, but with a different kind of attention, a patient attention, a respectful attention, the kind of attention that the Stales have been paying to Saskets for a very long time, and that has produced a body of knowledge about its habits and its needs, and its relationship to the human communities of its territory that no camera trap or DNA swab has been able to replicate. The forest is patient. The mountains are patient. The rivers run in the same channels they have run in since the ice retreated, and the valleys filled with forest. Whatever moves through those trees has learned patience from a landscape that practices it on geological timescales. And now, in the deepest part of the night, in whatever place you find yourself as this story closes, the thing to hold on to is this: the world is not fully known. The forests of British Columbia contain things that have not been named. The edge of the map is not the edge of what exists. Somewhere in those cedar stands, in those river canyons, in those glacial valleys that see no human visitor from one season to the next, something is awake. Something is paying attention. Something ancient and patient and not quite nameable is moving through the dark, leaving its prints in the soft earth by the rivers, watching the stars move across the sky through the gaps in the canopy above. It has been there a long time. It will be there when you wake up, and the morning light on those mountains, when it comes, will find the forest the same as it always has been, vast and deep and full of things that have not yet been explained. Rest now. The trees are still. The rivers are still running. Whatever watches from the forest watches quietly, and there is nothing for it to fear in the sound of your slow breathing and the gradual loosening of the day's thoughts and the long drift towards sleep. The mystery will be here when you return to it. These forests do not go anywhere. The creature does not go anywhere. The questions remain, suspended in the green and the dark, waiting with the patience of something that has learned, over a very long time, that waiting is what the forest does best. Good night. The coast of British Columbia is out there in the dark, and the trees are old, and the rain is soft, and something is awake in it that knows your name no better than you know its, and finds in that symmetry of mutual unknowing exactly the kind of peace that has always lived at the edge of what we understand. Sleep well. The forest holds you too. There is a name that does not appear often enough in the serious literature about this phenomenon: Bill Miller, not a famous name. Not a name attached to any single dramatic discovery or any widely circulated piece of evidence. Bill Miller was a logger who worked the Queen Charlotte Sound area of northern Vancouver Island and the adjacent mainland coast from the late 1950s until the early 1980s. He was not a researcher or an investigator. He was a man who worked in the woods, who spent more hours in the deep, old-growth forest of the central British Columbia coast than most people spend in a lifetime, and who kept, in a series of small pocket notebooks that his daughter found after his death in 2003, a quiet record of things he saw and heard in the forest that he could not explain. His daughter, whose name is Linda, shared the notebooks with a friend who was peripherally connected to the wildlife research community in British Columbia. The friend eventually shared excerpts, with Linda's permission, with a researcher who has been working on this question for more than 2 decades. What the notebooks contain is not a series of dramatic sightings. Most of what Miller recorded was small things. A smell near a camp that made the logging crew uneasy. A set of tracks in the mud of a river bar that the crew examined and argued about, and that no one could attribute, with confidence, to any animal they knew. A sound on 2 separate occasions, years apart, in different locations, that Miller described in both instances as sounding like something between a voice and a call, not a word, but with the structure of a word, with intention in it. On one occasion, in the summer of 1972, working in a section of forest near the Tsitika River watershed on northern Vancouver Island, Miller recorded seeing something that he described in the notebook as a large, dark shape moving upright through a burn, a section of forest that had been cleared by a recent fire, and where the standing dead trees were sparse enough to allow visibility across perhaps 100 meters. He wrote that it moved on 2 legs, that it was taller than any man he had seen, that it did not behave the way a bear behaves when it rises on its hind legs. He wrote that it moved quickly, and that when it reached the standing timber at the far edge of the burn, it disappeared into the shadows, and he heard nothing afterward. He told no one at the time. He wrote it in the notebook. Later in the same entry, he wrote, "I don't know what to say about it. I have been in the forest a long time. I have seen bears and elk and wolves, and 1 cougar and deer beyond counting. I know what those things look like. This was not any of those things." Bill Miller's notebooks are not evidence in any scientific sense. They are personal records, possibly inaccurate, impossible to verify after his death. But they are the kind of evidence that is everywhere in the British Columbia encounter record, and that nowhere has a formal place in the scientific literature, because they come from the wrong kind of person, in the wrong kind of format, and they describe something that the institutions of science have not yet created a space for. The history of science is partly a history of the people whose observations were not taken seriously because they lacked the right credentials or the right format for their records. The naturalists, who collected reports from sailors and traders and indigenous peoples in the age of exploration, produced much of the foundational knowledge of world biology that way. Not every report was accurate. Many were not. But the method of systematically gathering testimony from people who spent time in environments that researchers could not directly access was a legitimate and productive approach to expanding biological knowledge, and it produced results that laboratory methods alone could not have produced. The encounters recorded in the notebooks of people like Bill Miller, the informal accounts shared within indigenous communities, the confidential reports from wildlife professionals who requested anonymity, together form a body of testimony that would, if it concerned any other subject, be taken more seriously than it has been. The subject is the problem. The subject carries too much cultural baggage, too much association with hoaxing and entertainment, and the fringes of credibility, for the testimony to be evaluated on its own merits. And so it accumulates, quietly, outside the institutions that might make systematic sense of it. The Kootenay region of southeastern British Columbia. This is Rocky Mountain country, different in character from the coastal forest, but with its own deep wilderness and its own encounter tradition. The Ktunaxa Nation has called this territory home since before the last glaciation, and their knowledge of the landscape is as deep and as specific as that of any nation anywhere on the continent. The Ktunaxa traditions include accounts of a being they call, in their language, something that can be translated roughly as the one who lives in the forest alone. The description is consistent with what other nations across the province describe, but the quality of aloneness in the Ktunaxa designation is interesting. It suggests a being that does not exist in large social groups, that is encountered singly or in pairs more often than in numbers. This matches the pattern of encounter accounts from the region, which tend to involve single, large individuals rather than groups. In the Kootenay region, as in other parts of British Columbia, There is a significant history of encounters associated with the mining and logging industries that penetrated this landscape in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Miners working claims in remote creek valleys, loggers pushing into old-growth stands that had seen no human presence since the last indigenous hunting party, left occasional records, some in formal diaries and letters, some in the oral traditions of their communities, of encounters with something large and unexplained. One account from the Kootenay area that has been preserved through multiple transmissions concerns a prospector who worked a series of creek claims in the Selkirk Mountains in the years around 1910. He shared the account with his son, who told it to his own children, and one of those grandchildren, now elderly, shared it with a researcher in the early 2000s. The prospector, working alone at a claim in a remote creek valley, found one morning that his supply cache, which he had stored in a simple wooden box nailed to a tree at a height intended to be above the reach of bears, had been emptied. The box had been opened, not broken, with the simple wooden catch pushed back in the way it was intended to be pushed back. The supplies that had been in it, dried meat and hardtack and a tin of lard, were gone. The ground beneath the tree showed what the prospector described as a very large human footmark, just one, pressed into a patch of soft earth. He said the foot that made it would have had to belong to a giant. He left the claim that day and did not return. This account, like Bill Miller's notebook entries, is not evidence. It is a story, transformed through 3 generations of oral transmission, about something that happened to someone who is now long dead. It could be entirely fabricated. It could be a misremembered version of a mundane event that accumulated significance in the retelling. It could be an accurate record of a real encounter that has no explanation within the framework of what is known to inhabit the Selkirk Mountains. The researcher who collected it placed it in a file alongside dozens of similar accounts from the Kootenay region, accounts that span more than a century and that show the same cluster of characteristics: large footprints, cache disturbance, a quality of intelligent investigation rather than simple animal scavenging, often occurring in remote locations where the nearest other human presence was far away. Cache disturbance is a recurring element in the British Columbia encounter record that has not received the attention it deserves. The pattern is distinct enough to be significant. Food stores, whether miners' caches or campers' supplies or hunters' stored meat, are disturbed in ways that are inconsistent with the behavior of known British Columbia wildlife. Bears disturb caches by force, leaving marks of claws and teeth, and typically destroying both the container and much of the contents in the process. What the encounter record describes is different. Openings of containers that require manipulation, removal of food that suggests selectivity rather than indiscriminate consumption, no marks that are consistent with claws or teeth. In a number of accounts, the cache is disturbed, but the surrounding area shows large footprints and no other sign of the animal responsible. This does not definitively mean that a large unknown primate is opening food caches in the backcountry of British Columbia. There are other possible explanations, including human theft of unattended supplies. But the combination of cache disturbance with large unidentified footprints, recurring across many decades and many different geographic locations, is a pattern that would justify systematic investigation if it concerned any other subject. The Peace River country of northeastern British Columbia is the part of the province that most people, even people who live in British Columbia, think about least. It is the northeastern corner where the Rocky Mountains give way to the boreal forests and the agricultural lands of the Peace River Valley, a landscape more like Alberta than like the coast. The oil and gas industry has penetrated deep into this area, and the result has been a network of seismic lines and access roads that cuts through boreal forest for hundreds of kilometers in every direction from the main highway. Seismic lines, the straight cuts through the forest, made to allow the placement of sensors for underground mapping of hydrocarbon deposits, are particular places where wildlife encounters cluster. They are open corridors through otherwise dense forest, and large animals use them as travel routes. They are walked and driven by oil field workers who are in the forest at all hours, including in darkness, and who have no particular training in wildlife identification, but who have significant experience in the outdoors. The Peace River country has generated a steady stream of encounter reports, many of them from oil field workers, going back to the expansion of the oil and gas industry into the region in the 1960s. These reports differ in some ways from the coastal forest accounts. The landscape is more open, more visible, and encounters tend to involve longer observation distances and better views of the subject. The accounts from the Peace River area also tend to involve larger animals, which may reflect the possibility that the creature is bigger in the more northern and interior parts of its range, or may simply reflect the greater visibility that allows more complete observations. In the spring of 2003, a crew of 4 workers laying pipeline in a remote section of the Peace River area encountered something on a seismic line in the early hours of the morning. They were driving a truck along the line, and their headlights illuminated, at a distance they later estimated at 80 to 100 meters, a figure standing in the center of the line. The figure was upright on 2 legs. At the distance, in headlights, they had about 10 to 15 seconds of clear observation before the figure moved off the line into the forest on one side. 2 of the 4 workers were from Alberta and had never heard of Sasquatch except as a brand of boot wash. The other 2 were from British Columbia and knew the tradition but had never taken it seriously. None of the 4 spoke in the truck for perhaps 30 seconds after the encounter. Then the driver said, quietly, that he did not know what that was. The man in the passenger seat said he did not know either. They drove the rest of the seismic line in silence. One of the workers, the driver, mentioned the encounter to a cousin in British Columbia, who mentioned it to a friend who was tangentially connected to the community of people who follow this topic. The driver declined to be interviewed at length but confirmed the basic facts of the account. 4 witnesses, clear observation in headlights, a figure on 2 legs of unusual height and proportions, movement into the forest at a speed inconsistent with a running human. He said he had told very few people about it and that he preferred to keep it that way. He said he was not afraid of being called a liar. He said he was afraid of being thought of as someone who makes up stories, because he does not make up stories, and what he saw was real, and he has no explanation for it. The 4-witness encounter is a particularly important category in the encounter record. Hoaxes are possible with a single witness, or even 2 or 3. They become much more difficult to construct with 4 independent witnesses who did not have prior knowledge that they would see something, who were not predisposed to see something unusual, and who had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts before the encounter was known to any outside party. Multi-witness encounters in the British Columbia record are substantial in number, and they present a challenge to the hoax hypothesis that the single-witness encounter does not. Let us consider the trees themselves. The old-growth forests of British Columbia have been the subject of intense scientific study over the past 40 years, and some of what that study has revealed is relevant to the question of how a large, intelligent, unknown animal could persist in these forests without being found. Old-growth temperate rainforest is, biologically speaking, one of the most complex and productive terrestrial ecosystems on the planet. The above-ground biomass of old-growth Douglas fir and Sitka spruce forest in British Columbia exceeds that of tropical rainforest. The structural complexity of these forests, the layers of canopy and understory and fallen wood and root systems, creates an extraordinary number of ecological niches and microhabitats. The quantity and variety of food resources, from the salmon runs in the rivers, to the berry crops in the clearings, to the ungulate populations in the valley floors, to the insects and fungi and other invertebrates of the forest floor, could support a large omnivore at quite low population densities across a very large area. Low population density is itself an important concept in relation to this question. One of the reasons that the Sasquatch phenomenon is difficult to evaluate scientifically is that the encounter frequency, however you count it, suggests a relatively rare animal, not something you would expect to encounter on a typical walk in the forest. But relative rarity in an animal with a large home range and good behavioral strategies for avoiding human contact is not the same as absence. Wolverines, for example, are present across a very large area of British Columbia and are very rarely encountered, despite being active, mobile animals with significant body size. The wolverine's population density in British Columbia is low enough and its behavior cryptic enough that many wildlife biologists who work in the province have never seen one in the wild. Its presence is established through tracks and camera trap images and incidental sightings by hunters and backcountry workers, rather than through the direct observations of researchers. The same model of low-density, high-avoidance existence that characterizes wolverine populations is in principle applicable to a creature that is considerably more intelligent. The forest also provides, in its structure, a kind of concealment that people who have not been in old-growth temperate rainforest cannot easily imagine. The visibility in old-growth coastal forest is often extremely limited. The understory of sword fern and salal and devil's club can limit sightlines to 10 or 15 meters in the interior of a stand. The light, even on a bright summer day, is filtered to a dim green by the canopy overhead. In wet conditions, which are frequent on the coast, mist and rain reduce visibility further. A large animal that understands these conditions, that uses the forest structure deliberately to remain concealed, would have significant advantages in a landscape where most human movement is confined to trails and roads, and where off-trail travel in old-growth forest is slow and loud, and often effectively impossible. This is not speculative. Forest animals use forest structure for concealment routinely. Black bears are expert at using the visual complexity of forested terrain to disappear from observers within seconds. Mountain lions, which are large enough to be easily visible if they chose to be, are encountered so rarely in British Columbia, despite living at relatively high densities in some areas, that most people who hike regularly through lion country have never seen one. An animal with a brain large enough for sophisticated spatial reasoning, combined with the physical capability of moving quickly and silently through the forest, would have concealment options that exceed those available to any known British Columbia species. The physical capability aspect of this is worth dwelling on. The encounter accounts consistently describe a creature that moves through the forest with a speed and silence that witnesses find remarkable, even startling. People who have worked in the old-growth forest for many years say that the experience of watching something large disappear into dense bush without breaking branches or making audible sound is genuinely disorienting, because it requires a combination of physical agility and awareness of the environment that no large animal they know of possesses to that degree. A bear crashing through undergrowth is loud. An elk moving through dense forest is audible from a considerable distance. Something that can move quickly and quietly through the same terrain, that appears to know where the soft ground is and where the dry branches are, that moves with what witnesses describe as a deliberate awareness of the noise its movement could make, is behaving differently from any large mammal in the known fauna of the province. The year 2016, late October, the Sunshine Coast area of southwestern British Columbia, where the coast mountains come down to the sea north of Vancouver. A woman who was walking a section of trail near a provincial park had an encounter that she described, 3 years later, to a researcher who had been referred to her through a chain of personal connections. She had not told the story publicly before that conversation. She had told only her partner and one close friend. She was an experienced hiker, familiar with the local wildlife, and accustomed to solo travel in the forest. She described becoming aware, over a period of perhaps 10 minutes of walking, of a feeling that she was being followed. Not an irrational feeling, but a specific, bodily awareness of something moving in the forest alongside the trail, parallel to her direction of travel, keeping her pace, but not emerging onto the trail. She stopped. She heard nothing. She waited. She heard, after perhaps 30 seconds of stillness, a single footfall in the undergrowth, to her right, approximately 20 meters from the trail. One footfall, deliberate, then silence. She told the researcher that the sound of that footfall was what determined her conviction about what she had encountered. She had heard deer walk through undergrowth. She had heard bears move in forest. She had heard elk. She said this footfall had a weight to it that was different from any of those, a heaviness that she found herself involuntarily mapping to something very large, combined with a single-step quality, a bipedal rhythm rather than the 4-beat pattern of a quadruped. She said she did not consciously calculate this at the time. She said her body told her. She walked quickly back to the trailhead. She did not look back. When she reached her car, she sat in it for about 10 minutes before she felt able to drive. She said she was not afraid in any way that felt like danger from a predator. She said it was more like standing at the edge of something very large and very old, and becoming aware of exactly how small you are. She said she was sorry she was not able to describe it better than that. She said she was sorry she had not turned around. She said she thought about it often. The experiential quality of these encounters, the way they are described in terms of affect and somatic response, rather than purely in terms of what was seen or heard, is something that runs through many of the better accounts. The phrase very large and very old keeps coming up, in one form or another. The sense of encountering something with a presence that extends beyond the physical animal, that carries with it an implication of deep time, of having been in this forest for longer than any human frame of reference can contain. Whether this quality is a real property of the encounter or a retrospective imposition of significance on a more ordinary event is impossible to determine from the outside. But the consistency with which it appears in accounts from people who have had no exposure to each other, who would have no way to borrow this framing from one another, is notable. It is worth spending some time on the historical record of European exploration and early settlement in British Columbia, because that record contains more than has generally been recognized about encounters that were difficult to explain within the frameworks available to those early settlers and explorers. The fur trade brought European men deep into the forests and river systems of British Columbia from the late 18th century onward. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company extended their networks of posts and paddling routes into regions that no European had previously entered, relying heavily on the knowledge and skills of indigenous guides and on the labor of mixed heritage voyageurs who lived between the European and indigenous worlds. The diaries and letters of the officers of these companies, some of which are preserved in archives in Canada and Britain, contain occasional references to things observed in the wilderness that the writers could not account for. A Hudson's Bay Company post journal from a post on the Upper Fraser River, dated to the 1820s, contains an entry in which the clerk notes that one of the indigenous men attached to the post had refused to accompany a party into a certain section of the river valley, citing the presence of something in that section of forest that the clerk rendered in English as a very large wild man, hairy, who lived in the trees. The clerk's tone in recording this is dismissive. He attributes the refusal to superstition. But the record of the refusal itself, and of the reason given for it, is there in the archive. Similar references appear in the correspondence of early missionaries working in British Columbia in the mid-19th century. The missionaries, in their efforts to document indigenous cultures for the purposes of converting them, recorded many elements of those cultures, including beliefs about other beings sharing the landscape. The descriptions they collected and transcribed, filtered through the missionaries' own frameworks and often recorded skeptically, nonetheless contain enough detail to establish that what they were hearing about was consistent with what other observers, before and after, would describe. The early logging industry produced its own records, some of them preserved in company archives, and some in personal papers held by historical societies and family collections across the province. The logs and diaries of camp foremen and company superintendents from the late 19th and early 20th centuries contain occasional references to unusual finds or observations that workers reported. These references are typically brief and often dismissive, but they are there, establishing a continuous thread of encounter accounts from the earliest period of industrial resource extraction in the province. The pattern that emerges from these historical sources is not one of dramatic encounters, but of a consistent background presence. Something in the forest that indigenous peoples knew about and took seriously, that early European settlers and workers occasionally encountered and mostly dismissed or kept private, that has persisted as a quiet presence in the life of the British Columbia landscape across the full span of recorded history in the region. The persistence of this presence, across more than 2 centuries of European settlement, a period in which the forests of British Columbia have been subjected to enormous industrial pressure, and in which human activity has penetrated into areas that were previously inaccessible, suggests that whatever is generating the accounts is not easily disrupted by human presence and is not going away. We should talk about the Haida Gwaii kelp forests and the marine dimension of this, because it is less often discussed but genuinely relevant. The seas around the British Columbia coast are among the most biologically productive in the world. The Alaska Current brings cold, nutrient-rich water down from the north, feeding enormous kelp forest ecosystems and supporting dense populations of marine mammals, seabirds, and fish. The coastal indigenous peoples of British Columbia developed sophisticated relationships with these marine resources over thousands of years, and their knowledge of the coast includes knowledge of the waters as well as the forests. In several coastal indigenous traditions, there are accounts of encounters with large, hair-covered beings in beach and intertidal areas, particularly at dawn and dusk. The Nuksulk accounts of the Bella Coola River include descriptions of encounters near the river mouth. Suk traditions of the Central Coast include accounts of a large being that moves between the forest and the shoreline at certain times of year. The Haida traditions include accounts of a being that is seen occasionally on the beaches of the outer coast. These coastal encounter accounts are not widely discussed in the mainstream literature about this phenomenon, which has always been somewhat landlocked in its focus, preoccupied with footprints in the forest and with encounters in the interior. But if the creature is real, and if it has the behavioral flexibility and ecological range that the full encounter record suggests, there is no reason why it would confine itself to the forest interior. The coastal and intertidal zones of British Columbia offer seasonal food resources, particularly in relation to the salmon runs, that would be significant for a large omnivore. The beach environments of the outer coast, accessible only from the sea or through the forest, are among the least disturbed and least frequented areas of the province. In 2008, a kayaker traveling the outer coast of Haida Gwaii on a multi-week expedition found, on a remote beach with no road access and no trail access, a set of large footprints in the sand. The footprints were large enough to catch his attention immediately. He was an experienced outdoor traveler who had seen many kinds of animal and human tracks. He measured the prints at roughly 14 inches, using his boot as a reference. They appeared to be bipedal, with a human-like shape, but at a size he did not know how to account for. They led from the tree line to the surf zone and back to the tree line. He photographed them with his waterproof camera. The photographs were later posted to a small outdoor travel forum and eventually found their way to researchers in the field. The kayaker had no particular interest in the Sasquatch phenomenon. His original forum post described finding unusual footprints and asked if anyone could identify them. He received various suggestions, ranging from a very large bear to a person in unusual footwear. He noted in responses that he was familiar with bear tracks, and that these did not have the plantigrade bear anatomy or the claw marks that a bear's hind footprint would show. He never claimed with certainty that he knew what had made the prints. He simply documented what he found and asked for help identifying it, which is exactly the kind of response that is most credible in these situations. The acoustics of the old-growth forest deserve more attention than they have received in the literature. The old-growth temperate rainforest is an extraordinarily complex acoustic environment. The density of the canopy above, the softness of the forest floor below, the moisture in the air and in the vegetation, all affect the way sound travels and changes. Low-frequency sounds travel farther in this environment than high-frequency sounds. The deep, resonant vocalizations that encounter witnesses consistently describe hearing, the moaning or roaring quality that carries for long distances through the forest, are exactly the kind of sounds that would be produced by a very large vocal tract and that would travel effectively in the acoustic environment of the coastal temperate rainforest. The forest also amplifies and distorts sounds in ways that make locating a source difficult. The same quality of the forest that makes it acoustically distinctive also makes it confusing to navigate by sound. A sound that appears to come from one direction can be reflected from trees and topographic features to produce an apparent direction that is quite different from the true source. People who have extensive experience in the old-growth forest know this and account for it. People who are in the forest less frequently can be genuinely misled by acoustic effects that are real properties of the environment rather than properties of the sounds themselves. The researchers who have taken acoustic monitoring seriously in relation to this phenomenon have therefore been careful to note not just what sounds were heard, but where the listener was positioned relative to the surrounding topography and vegetation, in order to assess how the acoustic environment might have affected the apparent direction and distance of the sounds. This kind of careful attention to methodology is not always present in the popular literature on the subject, which tends to treat any unusual sound as simply evidence of the creature's presence, without attention to the complexities of how sound travels in forested terrain. But even accounting for these complexities, there is a subset of the acoustic evidence that is difficult to explain. The sounds that have been recorded on multiple occasions in remote forests across the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia, and that have been analysed by audio specialists, are in a frequency range and with a formant structure that does not match any known species of the region. The analysis of the Sierra Sounds recordings by Lynn Curlin was careful and methodologically sound, and its conclusion that the sounds were produced by a vocal tract significantly larger than a human male's has not been convincingly refuted. It has been ignored, which is a different thing. If there are sounds in the forests of British Columbia that are being produced by an unknown animal with a vocal tract significantly larger than any known species of the region, those sounds should be detectable by systematic acoustic monitoring with modern equipment. The technology now exists to deploy networks of acoustic sensors across large areas of wilderness and to analyze the resulting data in detail. The cost of such a program would be modest by the standards of normal biological research. The potential scientific value, if the program produced clear evidence of an unknown species, would be enormous. The reason it has not been done is not technical or financial, it is institutional. No institution with sufficient resources is willing to formally direct those resources toward this question. This institutional paralysis is itself a subject that deserves examination. Why has the scientific community in British Columbia been unable to formally engage with a phenomenon that has been generating consistent testimony for more than a century? Part of the answer is the nature of the evidence, which is largely testimonial rather than physical, and which therefore cannot easily be evaluated through the methods that science is most comfortable with. Part of the answer is the cultural contamination of the subject, the way that decades of hoaxing and entertainment have made it impossible to discuss Sasquatch without invoking the entire apparatus of fringe belief that surrounds it. But part of the answer is also something more uncomfortable. A serious engagement with this question requires taking seriously the indigenous knowledge traditions that have described this creature for thousands of years. And taking those traditions seriously, in the way that scientific engagement would require, means acknowledging a debt to those knowledge systems that the scientific community has not always been willing to acknowledge. The history of the relationship between Western science and indigenous knowledge in British Columbia is complicated and not always flattering to the scientific community. The dismissal of indigenous knowledge as mythology or superstition has been a consistent pattern in that history, and the dismissal of the Sasquatch tradition is not separable from that broader pattern of dismissal. A genuinely serious scientific engagement with this question would need to begin with a genuine reckoning with what indigenous peoples of British Columbia actually know and have known for a very long time. It would need to treat the Styles knowledge of Saskets and the Gitxsan knowledge and the Nuxalk knowledge and all the other traditions as a primary source rather than as folklore to be noted in passing and then set aside. It would need to be conducted in the kind of collaborative relationship with indigenous communities that is now required by law in British Columbia for any research conducted on First Nations territories. Such an engagement has not yet happened at any meaningful scale, but the framework for it exists. The legislative and institutional mechanisms for research collaboration between universities and First Nations in British Columbia have developed significantly over the past 2 decades. The willingness of some Indigenous communities to engage with outside researchers on these questions has also grown, though not without conditions, and not without a history of their knowledge being appropriated without credit or respect. If there is a path forward on this question, it likely runs through those relationships. Through the kind of partnership between Western scientific methods and Indigenous knowledge systems that British Columbia's environmental management community has been slowly and imperfectly learning to build, through a recognition that what the stats ales know about Saskets is not in competition with what wildlife biology might eventually establish about an unknown large primate, but is rather a different kind of knowledge about the same thing, a knowledge that has been accumulating for 10,000 years and that will still be there when the debates and the DNA analyses and the camera trap programs have run their course. This is the territory of mystery that matters most, and that is most poorly served by the way this subject is usually presented. The mystery is not simply the question of whether the creature exists, though that question is important. The deeper mystery is about knowledge itself, about how we know what we know, about whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't, about the relationship between the kind of knowledge that can be published in a peer-reviewed journal and the kind of knowledge that an elder transmits to a grandchild beside a river in the mountains of British Columbia. The knowledge systems that developed in this landscape over 10,000 years produced people who could navigate the coast mountains on foot, who could predict weather from the behavior of birds and the quality of light, who could identify 300 species of plant by sight and know which parts of each were edible, medicinal, toxic, or useful for other purposes. Those knowledge systems were built from the same raw material that Western science uses. careful observation, systematic testing, transmission of results, correction of errors over time. The difference is not in the quality of the epistemological process. The difference is in the institutional form that process takes and the prestige that attaches to different institutional forms. When the Stars Ales tell us that Saskets exists, that it has a territory and a behavior and a relationship with human communities that can be described with some specificity, they are drawing on a body of observation that is deeper and more extensive than anything that formal Sasquatch research has produced. They are not asking us to believe them on faith. They are reporting on a knowledge tradition that has been tested against experience over many generations. The appropriate response to this is not dismissal. It is not credulity either. The appropriate response is the kind of respectful engagement that good scientific practice requires when encountering knowledge that has been developed through methods that differ from, but are not inferior to one's own. What would it mean for our understanding of British Columbia's natural history if the creature the Stars Ales call Saskets were formally confirmed as a living species? The implications are significant and various. For taxonomy and evolutionary biology, the confirmation of a large primate in North America would require a substantial revision of our understanding of the history of primate dispersal and of the fauna of the continent over the past 100,000 years. For conservation, the discovery of a large, intelligent, presumably rare species in the forests of British Columbia would create immediate obligations under provincial and federal wildlife law. For the logging industry, which has continued to clear-cut old-growth forest at a rate that is genuinely alarming from a conservation perspective, the formal recognition of such a species would have legal and regulatory implications that the industry would not welcome. That last point is worth sitting with for a moment. The commercial incentives to not find evidence of an unknown large species in the forests of British Columbia are substantial. Old-growth logging in British Columbia is controversial and contested on many grounds, including the cultural and spiritual significance of old-growth forests to First Nations, the biodiversity value of ancient forests, and the carbon storage implications of clearing trees that have been growing for more than 1,000 years. The discovery of a large, unknown species in those forests would add another layer of legal and ethical complexity to an industry that is already under significant pressure. It would be too much to say that the corporate interests in old-growth logging in British Columbia have actively suppressed evidence of the creature's existence. There is no evidence of any such active suppression. But the general climate in which industrial resource extraction in old-growth forest has been normalized over more than a century, and in which the forest has been understood as a resource to be managed rather than an ecosystem to be understood on its own terms, has not created favorable conditions for the kind of long-term, careful, non-extractive presence in the forest that would be needed to document an elusive, intelligent, forest-dwelling, large animal. The people who have spent the most time in the forest with the least extractive purpose, the indigenous hunters and gatherers and knowledge keepers who have maintained their relationship with the old-growth landscape on the landscape's own terms, have known about this creature for as long as their traditions reach. The people who have spent the most time in the forest for extractive purposes, the loggers and miners and surveyors, have been generating encounter accounts for as long as their industry has been operating in the province. The people who have had the least time in the forest, who know it primarily through laboratories and publications and institutional frameworks, have had the most authority to define what is in it, and they have defined what is in it through that authority without engaging seriously with what the other two groups know. That is a failure of epistemology as much as it is a failure of science. It is the kind of failure that has consequences that extend beyond the specific question of whether Sasquatch is real. It is a failure of the imagination, a failure to take seriously the possibility that the world is larger and more complex than the current institutional framework of knowledge can accommodate. There are researchers who are changing this, slowly, and without the kind of institutional support that would allow them to change it faster. The growth of Indigenous-led environmental monitoring programs in British Columbia, in which First Nations use their own knowledge and their own protocols to document what is happening in their territories, is one place where a different approach to the landscape is emerging. These programs are not focused on Sasquatch. They are focused on salmon, on old-growth forest health, on the effects of climate change on alpine ecosystems, on the recovery of culturally significant plant and animal populations. But the methodology they use, the combination of Western biological monitoring techniques with indigenous ecological knowledge, is exactly the methodology that a serious investigation of this phenomenon would need to adopt. There are also individual researchers, working mostly outside institutional frameworks, because inside institutional frameworks, this topic is professionally dangerous, who are building the kind of evidence base that a serious scientific engagement would require, collecting encounter accounts in systematic ways that allow pattern recognition, conducting acoustic monitoring with good equipment in high encounter areas, analyzing footprint evidence with the rigor of forensic morphology, building relationships with indigenous communities that are respectful enough and sustained enough to allow serious knowledge exchange. These researchers are mostly unknown outside the small community of people who follow this question seriously. They are doing work that, in another context, on another subject, would be recognized as legitimate scientific inquiry. The history of science contains many examples of legitimate inquiry that was conducted outside the institutions of its time by individuals who did not have access to or support from those institutions, and that eventually produced results significant enough to be incorporated into the mainstream. The history also contains examples of legitimate inquiry that never got that recognition, that remained outside the mainstream forever, because the people doing it did not have the resources or the institutional backing to produce the kind of definitive evidence that would have been needed to force a reckoning. The Sasquatch question may be in the latter category, or it may be building toward the kind of evidence that will eventually produce a different outcome. It is not possible, from this vantage point, to know which. What is possible is to sit with the uncertainty, to recognize that the forests of British Columbia are large and old and full of things that we have not yet formally acknowledged, to take seriously the testimony of people who have spent time in those forests and who have come back with accounts of something they could not explain, accounts they gave without seeking attention, and often while requesting the protection of anonymity, to respect the knowledge systems of the peoples who have known these forests for 10,000 years and who have consistently described a being that the outside world has consistently failed to take seriously, to remain curious rather than dismissive, to hold the question open rather than closing it on the basis of evidence that is, when examined carefully, far less complete and far less definitive than the dismissals imply. The Pacific temperate rainforest at the edge of the world, the oldest living things on the North American continent, trees that were ancient when the first European ships entered these waters, the mountains that catch the clouds and build them into storms that break over the coast range and fill the rivers and sustain the salmon and sustain everything that depends on the salmon and everything that depends on everything that depends on the salmon, which is, in one way or another, almost everything in this ecosystem. In that forest, in those mountains, in those river valleys and glacier-carved fjords and offshore islands covered in old-growth spruce, something has been living for a very long time that we have not been willing to formally acknowledge. Something that the people who know the forest best have always known was there. Something that leaves its prints in the soft mud by the rivers and its vocalizations in the nighttime air of the mountains, and its presence in the uneasy awareness of everyone who spends serious time in the deepest and most remote parts of this extraordinary landscape. The question of what it is remains open. The question of whether it exists is answered differently depending on whose knowledge you start from. The question of what we owe it, if it is real, and what we owe the knowledge traditions that have always insisted it is real, regardless of whether we ever formally confirm its existence, is perhaps the most important question of all. And tonight, in the darkness of the hour when these stories have their proper home, the forests of British Columbia are out there, enormous and ancient and unhurried, containing whatever they contain, keeping whatever they keep, patient with the small species that has been arguing about the inventory of their inhabitants for longer than is perhaps reasonable. Sleep softly. The forest keeps its own counsel. And that, in the end, may be exactly as it should be. The rivers carry the rain back to the sea. The cedars grow another ring. The mountains stand in the dark above the clouds. Whatever moves through them tonight, moves through them as it always has, and leaves behind only what it chooses to leave behind. And the rest is silence, and the silence is deep, and the deep is very, very old. Good night. Let us return one more time to the question of the bones. because it is the question that every serious thinker about this subject eventually circles back to, and because there is an aspect of it that has not been adequately addressed in anything that has been written publicly about this phenomenon. The absence of skeletal remains is often treated as a single fact, as though it is a simple matter of absence. The bones should be there, and they are not. But the reality of how large animal remains are distributed in the British Columbia landscape is considerably more complex. Consider what we actually know about the distribution of large animal remains in the unmanaged wilderness of the province. Wolves, which are large carnivores present at reasonably significant densities in many parts of the province, die at rates that, given the population, should produce substantial numbers of wolf carcasses per year. Wolf skeletal remains are not commonly encountered in British Columbia wilderness. They are occasionally found in very specific circumstances, in rock crevices where predators have not been able to consume them, on exposed ridges where desiccation rather than microbial activity is the primary force at work, in isolated high-altitude locations where preservation conditions happen to be favorable. But in the coastal forest, in the wet, acidic soil of the temperate rainforest, wolf bones do not persist. The same is true of black bears, which are present in very high densities in many coastal areas and which die at rates that should leave detectable remains throughout the landscape. Bear remains in coastal old growth are not commonly found. The biology of decomposition in that environment is too efficient, the soil pH too acidic, the microbial community too active. If we accept that wolf and bear remains are not easily found in the coastal temperate rainforest of British Columbia, despite those animals being definitively present and dying at significant rates, then the absence of large primate remains in the same environment tells us very little about whether a large primate is present. The absence of remains is an expected outcome in this environment, whether the creature exists or not. In environments where bone preservation is better, in caves and in high alpine areas and in the arid interior, the absence of remains is more significant. But encounters in these environments, which include the Kootenay region and parts of the central interior plateau and the Peace River country, are associated with forests that are considerably drier and where the decomposition rates are faster and the acid levels are lower than in the coastal forest. Even in these environments, the search for remains has never been systematic. There is no research program anywhere in British Columbia that is actively searching for Sasquatch remains in habitats where bone preservation would be expected. The absence of remains found through incidental discovery in a landscape of nearly 1 million square kilometers without any systematic search is not meaningful negative evidence. This point bears repeating because it is one of the most important logical clarifications that can be made in relation to this phenomenon. The standards of evidence being applied when critics cite the absence of remains are inconsistent. We do not require that the remains of every known species be regularly discovered in the wild as evidence of those species' existence. We accept that most large mammals die in places and under conditions where their remains are never found by human observers. We should apply the same standard to the question of the Sasquatch remains. The communities of the North Coast, the rivers and fjords and outer islands of the north coast of British Columbia, between the city of Prince Rupert and the Alaska border, are some of the least accessible and least visited landscapes in the province. The Tsimshian peoples, whose territories include the lands around the mouth of the Skeena River and the islands of the north coast, and the Nisga'a Nation, whose territory follows the Nass River Valley into the Coast Mountains, both have traditions regarding large, hairy, bipedal beings in their territories. The Nisga'a tradition is particularly specific about location. Certain sections of the Nass River Valley, particularly in the upper reaches where the river cuts through the Coast Mountains in narrow canyons, are described in the tradition as places where encounters with large beings have been particularly frequent over the generations. These are areas of extreme remoteness, accessible by road only through a provincial highway that was completed in the 1990s, and that in earlier periods would have required travel by river or by trail through the mountain passes. A Nisga'a hunter, who was known within his community as an authoritative source on these matters, described, in a recorded conversation with a researcher from a university in the mid-1990s, a territory knowledge system in which the large being was included as a known presence in specific areas of the watershed at specific seasons and with specific behavioral characteristics that governed how hunters should manage their own behavior in those areas. He described this not as mythological knowledge, but as practical knowledge of the same kind as knowing where the sockeye salmon run or where the mountain goat habitat is. The being was part of the ecology of the Nass River watershed in his knowledge system as completely and as matter-of-factly as any other significant species. He described the smell as the most reliable indicator of presence. He said that experienced hunters in the Nass River territory knew the smell, and that when they encountered it, they knew to proceed with appropriate caution and respect. He described the smell in terms that matched the descriptions given by non-indigenous witnesses across the province. Very strong, unlike any known animal, complex in a way that was difficult to describe in language, but instantly recognizable once you had encountered it. He said he had encountered it 3 times in his life. Once as a young man, in a narrow valley east of the Nass, above the canyon section, where the smell had preceded, and then accompanied a feeling of being watched that he found intense enough to cause him to leave the area quietly. Once in midlife, on a hunting trip in the mountains above the river, where he had seen something move in a way that he was certain was upright bipedal movement through a section of timber that was too dense to allow good observation. And once, near the end of his active hunting years, he had found a bed similar to what the forestry technician Douglas Hayes had found near Harrison Lake, a depression in the forest floor, formed from bent branches, large, fresh, with the smell very strong around it. He had left that place immediately and had spoken about what he found only within his family. He said he was not afraid of the being. He said the tradition had taught him not to be afraid, that the appropriate response to its presence was respect and discretion, and that these encounters, while significant, were not fundamentally different from encountering any large and powerful being in the forest. He said the forest contained many things that were powerful and that required respectful management. This was one of them. The conversation was recorded with his permission and has been shared, in edited form, with a small number of researchers. It is not publicly available. He asked that it not be publicly available during his lifetime and, as far as can be determined, it has not been. The account described here is from the researcher who was present for the conversation, who has summarized it in discussions about the phenomenon over the years. This is the way that a substantial proportion of the most significant knowledge about this phenomenon is held, in private, in personal conversations, in confidential relationships between individuals whose trust has been established over time. It is knowledge that cannot easily be extracted from those relationships and placed in the public domain without violating the terms under which it was shared. It is knowledge that the institutional frameworks of science are poorly equipped to engage with, because those frameworks require public disclosure, formal documentation, and verifiability by independent observers. The encounter between a Western scientific framework that requires transparency and public verifiability and an indigenous knowledge system that requires discretion and relationship as conditions of transmission is one of the most interesting and least discussed aspects of the Sasquatch question in British Columbia. There is knowledge about this creature in the communities of the North Coast and the central interior and the southern coast that is not publicly available and may never be publicly available on the terms that Western science would require, and yet that knowledge is real and has been developed through processes as rigorous as any that Western science employs. Finding a way to engage with that knowledge respectfully, without either appropriating it or dismissing it, is one of the genuine challenges that a serious approach to this question would need to address. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention before we arrive at the end. It is the dimension of time. Not historical time, the span of documented encounters and oral traditions, but geological time, the deep time in which the landscape of British Columbia has been formed and transformed, and in which life in all its forms has been adapting to those transformations. The forests of British Columbia are young by geological standards. The great ice sheets of the last glaciation retreated from most of the province only between 10 and 15,000 years ago. Before the ice came, in the Pliocene and early Pleistocene, the Pacific coast of North America was substantially warmer than it is today, with forests extending further north and vegetation types that no longer exist in the region. The Beringian land bridge that connected Asia and North America was in existence in various forms during multiple glacial periods, providing opportunities for the dispersal of species between the two continents that do not exist today. During the last glaciation, when most of British Columbia was under ice, ice-free refugia persisted in certain areas, particularly on the outer coast and on the offshore islands, where ocean currents kept temperatures above the critical threshold for forest survival. These refugia, which modern genetic studies have revealed were significant sources of biological diversity for the recolonization of the province as the ice retreated, were islands of productivity in a sea of ice, and they were occupied by the full range of species that could survive in them, including, in the case of the Haida-Gwaii refugia, the distinct populations of plants and animals that subsequently recolonized the islands as they emerged from the ice. The refugia theory is relevant to the Sasquatch question in an interesting way. If a large primate was present on the Pacific coast of North America before the last glaciation, its populations would have been pushed into refugia during the glacial maximum and would have recolonized the newly exposed landscape as the ice retreated. The genetic bottleneck of a refugia population, followed by rapid expansion into new territory, is exactly the kind of demographic history that could produce the geographic distribution of encounters we see, with highest reported encounter rates in certain areas that may correspond to the areas first recolonized by an expanding post-glacial population. This is speculative. There is no fossil record of a large primate in North American pre-glacial fauna that would provide the foundation for this kind of population history. But the fossil record of the Pacific coast of North America is itself substantially incomplete, because much of what would have been the coastal zone during glacial maxima is now underwater. The sea level was more than 100 meters lower during the glacial maximum than it is today, which means that the coastline where a refugia population might have lived is now submerged, and the fossil record from that zone is essentially inaccessible with current technology. This is not a gap that is specific to the Sasquatch question. It is a general limitation of our understanding of the biological history of the Pacific Northwest during and after the last glaciation. The coastal archaeology of this region is severely limited by the fact that most of the coastline occupied by the earliest human inhabitants of the region is now underwater. The coastal fauna that shared the landscape with those early inhabitants is similarly poorly documented for the same reason. In that context of general incompleteness in the biological and archaeological record of the region, the absence of fossil evidence for a large primate is less anomalous than it might otherwise appear. The silence of the deep forest at 4 a.m. is different from any other silence. It is not empty. It is full of small sounds that the ear learns to identify after long enough presence in the forest. The drip of condensation from the canopy above, the settling of the enormous fallen logs that are as much a feature of the old-growth forest as the living trees, the occasional distant sound of a creek running over stones, the soft movement of air through the tops of the trees in a wind that does not reach the forest floor. It is a silence that is lived in, inhabited, not the silence of an empty place, but the silence of a place that is very full of life and very much occupied with the business of being alive, which is mostly quiet. In this silence, in the hours before dawn when the forest is at its most complete, people who spend extended time in the old-growth wilderness of British Columbia sometimes report a quality of awareness that is difficult to describe in ordinary language. Not a mystical experience in the supernatural sense, but a sharpening of perceptual capacity that comes from removing the ambient noise of modern life and spending sustained time in an environment where attention has real survival consequences. An awareness of the forest that goes beyond what the eyes and ears report moment to moment, an accumulation of small observations processed at a level that does not fully surface to conscious awareness, but that produces a global sense of the state of the environment. Whether there is something unusual nearby, whether the quality of the morning is different from the expected. Indigenous hunters describe this quality, in different languages and with different conceptual frameworks, as a kind of knowing that is not reducible to individual sensory inputs. A knowledge of the forest that comes from being in it long enough and quietly enough to understand it in a comprehensive way. It is within this kind of comprehensive awareness that encounters with the creature are most often reported as happening in the indigenous tradition. Not a sudden, surprising appearance, but a gradual becoming aware that something is present that was not previously noticed. A quality of presence at the edge of perception that resolves, slowly, into a specific thing, a shape in the undergrowth, a sound that has been there for some time before it was consciously registered, a smell that arrived before the awareness of its significance. This is the phenomenology of an encounter with something that is very good at not being encountered, if you encounter it anyway. It is consistent with an animal that has learned through long experience to manage its relationship with human perception, to move within the threshold of human awareness without triggering the full alertness that would result in a clear sighting. The creature is encountered, in the majority of accounts, not because it made a mistake and revealed itself, but because something in the encounter situation, an unexpected change in wind direction, an accidental noise, a closer approach than anticipated, crossed a threshold that the creature's management strategy was not designed to handle. This would explain why encounters cluster in particular situations, near rivers, where the sound of running water masks the sounds of approach and narrows the perceptual window of both parties, at dawn and dusk, when light conditions are ambiguous and the transition from sleep to wakefulness affects alertness, in areas of recent human disturbance, where the creature's normal patterns of avoidance have been disrupted by changes in the landscape. These are exactly the circumstances in which a highly intelligent animal with a generally successful strategy of avoidance would be most likely to come into inadvertent contact with human observers. The Stikine River hunters, who saw the creature drinking from the bank in 2004, encountered it at what appeared to be a moment of focus on another activity, its attention directed to the river and its own behavior, rather than to the human presence on the water. The woman on the Sunshine Coast Trail, who became aware of something pacing her at a parallel distance, encountered it when she stopped unexpectedly, introducing a change in the situation that the creature did not immediately process. The trail crew in the Squamish Valley, who found the line of broken branches at 8 feet, was seeing the aftermath of a transit through a section of understory where the creature had apparently not been concerned about concealment, perhaps because it judged the terrain to be sufficiently remote. Each of these encounters makes sense as an encounter with a real animal that is genuinely very good at not being seen, but that is not infallible. The pattern across the encounter record is not of a creature that is choosing to reveal itself to selected observers. It is of a creature that is maintaining a consistent policy of avoidance that occasionally fails, for reasons that are comprehensible, in terms of the ecology and behavior of a large, intelligent, forest-dwelling animal. In the years since John Bindernagel's death in 2018, the community of researchers who take this question seriously has continued to work, most of them without institutional support, some of them with the kind of careful methodology that Bindernagel modeled in his own work. The tools available to them have improved. Acoustic monitoring technology has become cheaper and more capable. Environmental DNA analysis has become more accessible. Camera trap technology has improved in resolution and in the reliability of its motion triggers. Satellite and aerial imaging has made it possible to identify and map old-growth forest features that were previously inaccessible without physical presence. None of these tools has yet produced the definitive evidence that would compel formal scientific acknowledgement. But the accumulation of anomalous data continues. The encounter accounts continue to be reported by people with professional reputations to protect and strong incentives to stay quiet. The indigenous knowledge traditions continue to maintain what they have always maintained, that the being exists, that it has always been in these forests, and that the question of its existence is not a question. What would change the situation? What would it take for the scientific and cultural mainstream of British Columbia to formally engage with this phenomenon in a serious way? The most likely catalyst is probably a DNA analysis from a well-documented sample with clear chain of custody that returns results indicating an unknown primate. Such a result, published in a legitimate peer-reviewed journal, would be impossible to ignore in the way that everything else has been ignored. It would require a response from the scientific community that engaged seriously with the data rather than dismissing the question. Such a sample may eventually be obtained. Environmental DNA monitoring programs in British Columbia waterways are expanding, and as they expand into more remote areas, the probability that they will encounter DNA sequences from an unknown large primate, if such an animal is using those waterways, increases. The technology is developing in directions that make this scenario more likely with each passing year. Or the catalyst may come from an unexpected direction, as these things often do in the history of science. A trail camera image, clear enough to be undeniable. A vocalization recording of sufficient quality and from a provenance secure enough to withstand scrutiny. a footprint of such quality and in such circumstances that its authenticity cannot be reasonably challenged. These things may happen, or they may not. The forest is patient, and the creature that inhabits it, if it inhabits it, has been patient for a very long time. The great cedar trees of British Columbia can grow for more than 1,000 years. The oldest ones, still standing in the unlogged old growth, were already old when the first European ships entered Pacific waters. They have grown through the full span of recorded human history in this region, and through much that is not recorded, and they will continue to grow through whatever comes next. The forest does not measure time in the way that human beings measure time. It measures time in the growth of roots and the accumulation of heartwood and the slow building of the soil beneath the fallen logs. In that time, in that deep, slow vegetable time, whatever moves through the forest has moved. Whatever has left its prints in the riverside mud, and its sounds in the nighttime air, and its presence in the awareness of the people who know this landscape, has been doing so for longer than the question of what it is has existed, longer than Western science has existed, longer than the written records that we use to establish what is real. The forest keeps its own records. In the growth rings of the trees, in the layers of the peat, in the sediment of the lake bottoms, in the DNA of every organism that has lived and died and decomposed in the forest floor, there is a record of everything that has happened in this landscape. We cannot read most of it. We do not have the tools, yet, to read all of it, but it is there. Everything that has ever been in these forests has left something of itself in the forest. Something persists. Something circulates through the food web, the water cycle, the slow chemistry of the soil. If the creature is real, it too has left itself in the forest in all the ways that living things leave themselves. In the soil, in the water, in the accumulated observations of the people who have shared this landscape with it. The question is only whether we will be patient enough, humble enough, and willing enough to look. The sound of the rain on the canopy above, the soft creak of the old trees, the rush of the river in the valley below, the gradual lightening of the sky that begins, hours before sunrise, as a barely perceptible difference in the quality of the darkness overhead. And through it all, the forest going about its business, which is the business of being alive, the most complicated and various and endlessly surprising business there is, conducted in the dark, in the wet, in the cold, in the deep time of the centuries and the millennia. Whatever is in those trees, it is part of that business, part of the complexity, the variety, the endless surprise. And knowing that, feeling the weight of it in the darkness of the small hours, is enough to carry you gently from this story into sleep. Into the kind of sleep that the forest itself practices, not absence but deep presence, the metabolism of a living system, continuing its work through the dark hours without ceremony or self-consciousness, simply being what it is, simply doing what it does, in the ancient and unhurried way of things that have always been here and intend, patient and quiet and enormous, to remain. Good night. The British Columbia forest is out there, enormous and old, and woven through with things we have not yet named. Some of them are trees, some of them are rivers, some of them are the salmon returning from the ocean to the streams where they were born, guided by a memory that science has only begun to understand. And some of them, perhaps, are something else, something that watches the salmon and the trees and the rivers and the people who have tried, for so very long, to understand this landscape, with the same patient, knowing attention that it has always brought to bear on everything that moves through its forest. It sees you, it has always seen you, and it chooses, as it always has, to remain exactly where it is, just past the edge of the light, just past the edge of the certain, in the forest that it knows better than anyone, waiting with the quiet patience of something that has nowhere else to be and no reason at all to hurry. Rest now, you are safe. The forest holds this moment and every moment. Sleep well. There is one final thing to say before this long walk through the forests of British Columbia comes to its end. One final thread that has been running beneath everything else, that surfaces now in the quietest part of the night, when the day's arguments and evidences and counter-evidences have settled, and what remains is something simpler and perhaps more true. The reason this question matters, the reason people keep coming back to it across more than a century of documented history, is not really about taxonomy or evolutionary biology or the completeness of the fossil record. The reason it matters is that it speaks to something fundamental in the human relationship with the unknown, with the possibility that the world is larger and stranger and more various than we have allowed ourselves to believe, with the uncomfortable and wonderful possibility that even in the most documented and surveyed and studied landscape in the province, there are things that have maintained their mystery against all our attempts to inventory and classify and understand. The forests of British Columbia are a place where that mystery is still possible, where you can still walk into old-growth cedar and within an hour be in country that has seen no human presence since the last hunting party passed through in a season that no one now living remembers. Where the trees are old enough and the terrain complex enough and the ecology intact enough that a large, intelligent animal could persist without formal acknowledgement by the institutions that define what officially exists. That possibility, that there is still room in the world for something unknown and large and old and patient, is itself a kind of gift. The closure of all mysteries, the full inventory of all existence, the complete classification of everything that lives on this earth, would be a loss as well as a gain. The mystery is part of what makes the forest what it is, part of what draws people to it and keeps them returning, the sense that the edge of the known is real and close and permeable, that you could cross it any morning, walking quietly in the rain, through the old-growth understory, and find on the other side something that changes your understanding of everything. The people who have crossed that edge, the hunters and loggers and wildlife workers and kayakers and hikers and indigenous knowledge keepers who have come back from the forest with accounts they could not explain and mostly chose not to publicize, all of them carry something that the rest of us can only approach through their testimony, the direct experience of encountering a genuine unknown, of standing in the presence of something that does not fit, of being looked at by something whose gaze carries the weight of an intelligence that is not human but is not absent. That experience, whatever its ultimate explanation, is real. The people who have had it are real. What they bring back from it is real, even when it cannot be placed in a museum, or published in a journal, or confirmed by an independent observer. It is real in the way that the forest itself is real, in a dimension that exceeds our current capacity to formally document it, but that persists regardless. The cedars are still growing, the rain is still falling, the rivers are still running cold and clear, and full of memory from the mountains to the sea. And somewhere in those mountains, in those valleys, in those ancient stands of forest that have been growing since before anyone living was born, something is moving through the trees in the dark, as it has always moved, as it will continue to move, patient and enormous and entire. Sleep, now. Let the forest hold you. Let the mystery hold you. Let the long, deep, unhurried time of the old growth surround you and carry you into the kind of rest that the forest itself rests in. Not unconscious, but deeply present, deeply alive, deeply at home in the dark of the world. Good night. The British Columbia wilderness is out there, and it is full, and it is patient, and it is very, very old. And whatever is in it that we have not yet named looks out from the tree line with calm, dark eyes and sees the light of your screen in the dark and turns, unhurried, back into the trees. The ravens are the first to know. They always are. Before any other sign reaches the forest floor, before the smell or the sound or the sense of something watching, the ravens go quiet. 3 ravens that have been calling back and forth across the canopy for the last 20 minutes fall silent at precisely the same moment. The silence moves through the forest like a tide coming in. First the ravens, then the smaller birds, then the insects, until the only sound is the drip of rain from the cedar boughs and the slow creak below. Something has changed in the forest. Something is near that was not near before. The ravens know. They have always known. And now, in the last quiet moment before sleep takes you completely, you know too. The forest breathes. The mystery endures. Good night. Whatever name you give it, whatever category your mind reaches for when it tries to place it, the creature in the forests of British Columbia remains exactly what it has always been. Older than the names, older than the categories, older than the debate. It was here before the debate began, and it will be here when the debate has ended, and something else has taken its place in the long conversation between human beings and the world they live in. The forest does not care about the debate. The trees do not care. The creature, if it is real, does not care. Only the humans care, because only the humans need the world to be fully explained before they can rest in it. The forest rests without explanation. The creature rests without explanation. And tonight, In this long quiet after the story, you can rest without explanation too. And so it goes. The old trees know, the rivers know, and somewhere in the darkness of the old-growth forest, something else knows too, and has always known, and will go on knowing long after this night, and every night, like it has passed into the deep quiet of the past.